Welcome back to Sleepy Tinfoil Hat. Settle in, get comfortable, and let your shoulders drop for a moment, because tonight we are going to take a long, slow walk through one of the strangest, most misunderstood stretches of human history. 1,000 years of European life that most of us were taught to picture as muddy, miserable, and largely empty of wonder. Medieval Europe. The phrase itself carries a kind of grey weight, doesn't it? Castles in the rain, plague carts, illiterate peasants stooped over fields. That's the version we inherited. That's the version printed in the textbooks and stamped onto the documentaries. But the deeper you actually look into the records, the chronicles, the church inventories, the trial transcripts, the merchant ledgers, and the marginalia scribbled into the corners of illuminated manuscripts, the more you start to notice something quietly unsettling. The official story has gaps in it. Not small gaps, enormous ones. Gaps wide enough that whole categories of human experience seem to have slipped through. And what fills those gaps when you start paying attention are secrets. Some of them are charming, some of them are macabre, and a few of them genuinely do not fit the timeline we were handed. Tonight, we are going to examine those quietly, carefully, and at length, the way you might turn an old coin over and over in your palm by candlelight, watching how the markings catch the flame. Before we go any further into the dark, I want to ask you something directly. If you find this kind of slow, late-night exploration useful for falling asleep, or if part of your brain genuinely enjoys chewing on historical mysteries while the rest of you drifts off, please consider subscribing to Sleepy Tinfoil Hat. It costs you nothing, it tells the algorithm we exist, and it lets me keep making these long-form pieces for the people who actually want to think while they rest. And I am genuinely curious, because the audience for this channel is scattered across some unusual corners of the world. So if you would, leave a quiet comment below telling me where you are listening from tonight. The country, the city, the time on your clock if you feel like it. I read those comments. They map out something I find genuinely moving. This strange, invisible network of people who are awake, or trying not to be, in towns I have never seen, all listening to the same story at the same hour. Now, lower the lights, if you have not already. Pull the blanket up. We are going in. Here is the framing question for everything that follows. Why does medieval Europe, despite being one of the most studied periods in Western history, still feel like it has a locked room inside it that historians keep walking past? The mainstream explanation for this is, on its face, completely reasonable. Records were destroyed. Fires consumed monasteries. Wars erased archives. Most people could not write, so most people did not leave a trace. Latin was the language of the literate, which means the surviving documents are skewed heavily toward the concerns of a small clerical elite. The peasants, who were 90% of the population, are essentially silent across 1,000 years. We see them only when they appear in someone else's tax roll, or court record, or sermon. So of course there are gaps. That is the standard answer, and it is not wrong. It is just incomplete. Because once you accept that we are missing 90% of the voices, you have to ask the harder follow-up question. What were those voices saying? What were they doing in their homes at night? What did they actually believe was happening in the forests, in the rivers, in the long pauses between church bells? And here the alternative perspective starts to become interesting, because the fragments we do have, the marginal notes, the folk customs preserved in later centuries, the accidentally recorded testimony from heresy trials and witch trials, suggest that the inner life of medieval Europe was vastly stranger and more layered than the cathedral and king version we inherited. Let me give you the first concrete example, because I want this to stay grounded rather than drifting into vague mysticism. Consider the question of sleep itself. For most of the 20th century, historians assumed that medieval people slept the way we do, in one long, unbroken block. 8 hours, give or take, from dusk until dawn. It seemed like such an obvious assumption that nobody questioned it. Then, in the 1990s, a historian named Roger E. Kirsch began combing through old diaries, court depositions, medical texts, and literary references. And he noticed something strange. References kept appearing to something called first sleep and second sleep. A first sleep that began shortly after dark, then a wakeful period in the middle of the night, sometimes lasting an hour or two, during which people prayed, talked to their spouses, tended fires, visited neighbors, had sex, wrote letters, or simply lay in bed thinking. And then a second sleep, which carried them through to morning. This pattern shows up over and over in dozens of languages across centuries. It was so normal that nobody bothered to explain it, the way nobody today writes a sentence explaining what breakfast is. The mainstream interpretation now is that biphasic sleep was simply the natural human pattern before artificial lighting, and that we lost it sometime in the 17th and 18th centuries when oil lamps and then gas lamps made the evening usable. That is probably true, but notice what it implies. It implies that an entire dimension of human experience, a quiet, wakeful interval in the middle of every single night, has been edited out of our picture of the past. A medieval person had a relationship with the dark that we no longer have. They had hours of contemplative half-consciousness that we have replaced with continuous unconscious sleep. And we did not even know this until 30 years ago. So the question naturally becomes, what else have we been quietly missing? That is the spirit in which I want you to listen tonight. Not as a believer in any particular alternative theory, not as a debunker waiting to roll your eyes, just as someone willing to consider that the official narrative, while largely accurate in its broad shape, has soft spots. Places where the timeline does not quite match the artifacts. Places where the explanations feel slightly too tidy, like a story smoothed by retelling. We are going to look at medieval cities that seem to have disappeared without proper explanation. We are going to look at construction techniques in cathedrals that arguably should not have existed yet. We are going to look at strange recurring symbols carved into the margins of churches across countries that supposedly had no contact with each other. We are going to look at the dancing plagues, the bread visions, the persistent reports of small humanoid figures in the woods that show up in legal documents centuries before anyone called them folklore. We are going to look at the curious fact that medieval maps sometimes contain coastlines that were not, by any orthodox account, possible to know about. And we are going to look at the bodies, the mass graves that do not match any recorded outbreak, the skeletons buried face down with stones in their mouths, the bog people who were ritually killed in ways the church supposedly stamped out hundreds of years before. None of this requires you to believe in anything supernatural. It only requires you to take seriously the possibility that medieval Europe was not a 1,000-year intermission between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance, but something far more complex, with its own logic, its own technologies, its own ways of knowing, much of which has been lost or deliberately overwritten. The tone I want to hold throughout this is one of patient curiosity, not the breathless certainty of a conspiracy video, not the dismissive chuckle of an academic explaining things to children. Somewhere in between, where you and I can sit and simply ask, what would it actually take to be confident about what happened 1,000 years ago? The honest answer is, more than we have. The chronicles were written by monks who were paid by kings. The legal records were filtered through scribes with agendas. The folklore was collected, when it was collected at all, by 19th century antiquarians who sanitized it for their middle-class readers. Almost everything we think we know about medieval daily life passes through several layers of editing before it reaches us. And every layer is a place where information could be smoothed, simplified, or removed. So when we encounter something in the historical record that does not fit, we have a choice. We can dismiss it as an outlier, a misunderstanding, a quirk. Or we can hold it gently in our minds and ask whether it might be a thread, and whether pulling on that thread might reveal something larger underneath. Tonight, we are going to pull on quite a few threads, slowly, with no agenda except seeing where they go. And I want you to understand that I am not going to tell you the threads lead somewhere specific. I do not know where they lead. Nobody really does. That is the entire point. The honest position when looking at medieval Europe is not certainty in either direction, but a kind of alert humility. The records are incomplete. The interpretations are contested. The artifacts keep producing surprises. And the deeper you go, the more you realize that the comfortable image of knights and peasants and cathedrals is a thin painted surface laid over something vast, dark, and only partially understood. So let us begin lifting that surface, gently, one corner at a time. Let your breathing slow. Let the room around you fade a little. We have a long night ahead. 2101. Claude responded, "Let us start with the cities that should not have vanished. Let us start with the cities that should not have vanished." This is one of the strangest categories of medieval mystery, and it is also one of the most under-discussed, because it lives in that awkward space between archaeology and rumor, where serious historians get nervous and amateur enthusiasts get carried away. The truth, as usual, sits somewhere in the quiet middle. The basic fact is this. Across medieval Europe, there are dozens of documented settlements, some of them substantial, some of them merely villages, that appear in tax records, in church registries, in merchant correspondence, in royal charters, and then simply stop appearing. Not gradually, not with a recorded plague or fire or war. They are there in one decade, and in the next decade, the records refer to them in the past tense, if at all. The mainstream explanation for most of these disappearances is, again, completely reasonable on its surface. The Black Death of the 14th century, climate shifts during the so-called Little Ice Age, the slow drift of populations toward larger commercial centers, the collapse of feudal arrangements that made certain marginal villages economically unviable. All of these are real factors. All of them genuinely did empty settlements across Europe. The deserted medieval villages of England alone number in the thousands, and most of them have been thoroughly studied and reasonably explained. But within that very large category of explained disappearances, there sit a smaller number of cases that have never quite fit the standard story. And it is those cases that are worth lingering on tonight. Take, for instance, the curious matter of Rungholt. Rungholt was a settlement on the North Frisian coast, in what is now the Wadden Sea on the German shoreline. According to the surviving records, it was a substantial trading town, prosperous enough to mint its own coins and to appear in the trade networks of the Hanseatic League. And then, in January of 1362, a massive storm surge known as the Grote Mandrenke, which translates roughly as the Great Drowning of Men, swept across the coastline and destroyed it. That much is straightforwardly historical. There is no mystery about the storm itself. What is strange is the relationship between the legend of Rungholt and the archaeological reality of it. For centuries, Rungholt was treated as a kind of folk tale. A wicked town swallowed by the sea as divine punishment, the sailors said, with church bells that could still be heard ringing beneath the waves on quiet nights. Historians dismissed it as a moral fable. And then, in the 20th century, divers and archaeologists began finding the actual physical remains of the town in the tidal flats, foundations, wells, drainage systems, pottery, even what appeared to be the remnants of a harbour. The town was real. Its destruction was real. But here is the part that nobody really likes to discuss. The size of Rungholt, based on the archaeological footprint that has now been mapped using magnetic gradiometry and aerial surveys, appears to be significantly larger than the surviving documents would suggest. Either the medieval chroniclers underreported the scale of the place, or the archaeological footprint includes structures that predate the medieval town entirely, or, and this is the question that historians are reluctant to entertain, our basic chronological assumptions about coastal settlement in Northern Europe may be off by a margin that makes everyone uncomfortable. Rungholt is solved, officially. But the answers we have do not quite cover everything we have found, and the gap between the legend and the artifacts has never fully closed. This pattern repeats elsewhere. Consider the case of Veneta, sometimes called the Atlantis of the Baltic. According to medieval German and Scandinavian sources, Veneta was a vast, wealthy trading city on the southern Baltic coast, possibly somewhere near the modern Polish island of Wolin. The chroniclers describe it in extravagant terms. A city of merchants from many nations, with stone buildings and elaborate harbours, swallowed by the sea sometime around the 11th or 12th century. The mainstream view is that Veneta is a confused folk memory of the genuine medieval Slavic trading settlement at Wolin, which was indeed prosperous and which did indeed decline, though not because the sea swallowed it. The decline was gradual, economic, and political. That is the official story. But here is where it gets quietly strange. The descriptions of Veneta in the medieval sources do not really match Wolin. The scale is wrong. The architecture described is wrong. The geography is wrong. And the chroniclers who wrote about Veneta were not writing about a vague myth. They were writing the way they wrote about other real cities, with details about specific districts, specific trades, specific peoples. So either they were inventing all of it, which is possible but unusual for the genre, or they were describing something that genuinely existed and that we simply have not located. The Baltic coastline has shifted significantly since the medieval period. The sea level has changed. The shorelines have moved. There are submerged structures off the Polish and German coasts that have never been fully surveyed. Veneta might be down there, or it might never have existed, or it might be something in between, a real place exaggerated into legend, with the original archaeological footprint waiting somewhere we have not yet looked. We do not know. And the honest acknowledgement of that not knowing is what historians often skip over when they summarize the case. There is something deeply human about the medieval relationship to lost cities, and I think it is worth pausing on this for a moment, because it matters for everything else we are going to discuss tonight. The medieval mind did not draw the same hard line we draw between history and myth. When a chronicler wrote about a city that had been destroyed, they did not feel obligated to specify whether the destruction was literal, symbolic, allegorical, or some combination of all three. They wrote with what we might call a layered truth. The city was real. The destruction was real. The moral lesson embedded in the destruction was also real, and arguably the most important layer to them. We have inherited their texts and stripped away the moral and symbolic dimensions, leaving only the bare factual claims, and then we have judged those bare claims by modern evidentiary standards. That is not necessarily wrong, but it does mean we are reading their writing in a way they did not intend it to be read. When a 12th century monk writes that Veneta was punished for its pride and swallowed by the sea, he is not necessarily saying that the literal sea swallowed a literal city in a single night. He may be saying something much more complicated, about decline, about moral collapse, about the way prosperous trading centers attract foreign influences and then lose their character. And we, reading him 800 years later, see only the surface claim and either accept it or reject it. Both responses miss what he was actually trying to communicate. Now let me bring this closer to the ground, because abstract talk about medieval epistemology can drift into vagueness, and I want to keep this concrete. There is a category of lost settlement that is much more pedestrian than Rungholt or Vineta, but in some ways, much stranger. These are the deserted medieval villages, the DMVs as British archaeologists call them, that appear all over the European landscape as faint humps and rectangles in pasture fields. Most of them have been explained. Plague, enclosure, climate, economic restructuring. But a smaller subset of them resist explanation because they were abandoned at times when no plague was recorded in the area, no enclosure was happening, no climate event has been documented, and the surrounding villages were thriving. The records simply stop. The fields go quiet, the buildings collapse, and nobody, in any surviving document, comments on it. This is genuinely odd. Medieval people were notoriously good at recording things that disturbed them. They wrote about strange weather, about unusual births, about heretics and miracles and visions, about cattle plagues and crop failures, and processions of penitents. If a village simply emptied out, you would expect somebody, somewhere, to mention it, even in passing, even in a marginal note. And yet for a number of these villages, there is nothing. The mainstream view is that the silence is just an accident of preservation. The records that mentioned the abandonment must have existed once and been lost. That is plausible. But it is striking how often the same pattern repeats. Silent abandonment, no surviving comment, and a kind of folkloric wariness around the site that persists into later centuries. Locals avoid it. Sheep refuse to graze on certain spots. The new road, when it comes through, bends around it. None of this proves anything, but it accumulates. It accumulates in a way that makes you wonder whether there was something the medieval observers chose not to write down, or were forbidden to write down, or did not have a vocabulary for. And this brings us to the deeper question that runs underneath all of these cases. Why do certain medieval places generate folklore long after their official histories have ended? The orthodox answer is that folklore fills the vacuum left by lost records, that human imagination is uncomfortable with empty space and tends to populate it with stories. That is true as far as it goes, but it does not explain why the folklore so often clusters around specific archaeological anomalies, the way iron filings cluster around hidden magnets. The lost villages with the strangest legends are often the ones that, when finally excavated, produce the most unusual finds. Coins from regions the village should not have traded with. Religious objects that do not match the official theology of the period. Burials that do not follow the standard Christian orientation. Tools and pottery from cultures that supposedly had no presence in the area. The official explanation for these anomalies is always the same. Stray finds, heirloom objects, unusual individuals, trade goods carried farther than expected, and each of these explanations is reasonable in isolation. But when you stack them together across hundreds of sites, you start to see a pattern. Medieval Europe was more connected, more layered, and more strange than the standard narrative allows. The lost villages are not just empty footprints in the grass. They are places where the official story thins out, and where, if you know how to look, you can sometimes see what was underneath. So tonight, as you drift, hold this image in your mind. A field at dusk in the late autumn, the grass long, the light low, the wind moving through it slowly. Underneath the grass, the foundations of houses that nobody remembers, a well capped with a stone, the faint outline of a road that goes nowhere now, and somewhere in the soil, an object that does not belong, a fragment of pottery from a kingdom 300 miles away, or a coin from a century before the village was supposedly founded. The official record says the village was abandoned in the 14th century due to plague. the folklore says something else. The artifacts, when they are finally lifted from the ground, say a third thing entirely. And the work of the careful listener is not to choose among these three voices, but to hold them all together, gently, and to ask what kind of past could have produced all of them at once. Tonight, I want to take you inside a cathedral. Not to admire it exactly, though that is part of it. I want to take you inside one of these enormous stone buildings the way an engineer might walk through one, looking up at the ceiling and quietly running the numbers, because the numbers are part of where this story gets interesting. The standard image of medieval cathedral construction is one of slow, almost organic growth. Generations of stonemasons working with simple tools, passing techniques down from father to son, raising these vast structures over 100 or 200 years through patient accumulated effort. That image is not wrong. The construction really did span generations. The masons really did work with chisels and hammers and pulleys and timber scaffolding. The patience was real. But underneath that comfortable picture sits a set of technical questions that historians of architecture have been quietly arguing about for decades, and the arguments do not have clean answers. The cathedrals, in certain specific ways, are harder to explain than the standard narrative admits. Consider Chartres Cathedral in northern France, completed in its current form around the year 1220. The vaulted ceiling rises about 37 meters above the floor, which is roughly the height of a 12-story building. The stones in the vault are held in place primarily by their own weight and by the careful geometry of the arches that distribute the load down through the ribs and into the flying buttresses outside. This is the standard explanation, and it is correct as far as it goes. What it does not quite address is the precision required to make it work. The angles of the ribs, the curvatures of the arches, the load calculations that determine how thick a flying buttress needs to be at a given height to counteract a given outward thrust. Modern structural engineers, when they study these cathedrals, often note that the medieval builders solved problems that the formal mathematics of the period could not actually describe. The geometry was correct. The structures stood. They are still standing 800 years later. But the written mathematical tradition of the 12th and 13th centuries did not contain the analytical tools that would let you calculate these things from first principles. The masons were doing it some other way. The mainstream explanation is that they were using accumulated rules of thumb, geometric tricks passed down within the Masonic guilds, proportional systems based on simple ratios that happen to produce structurally sound results. This is almost certainly true, but it raises an obvious follow-up question. Where did the rules of thumb come from? Who developed them? Through what process of trial and error? Because the failure modes of medieval cathedral construction, when builders got the geometry wrong, were spectacular and well documented. Towers collapsed. Vaults fell in during construction. Whole sections of nave came down years after completion. We have records of these failures. What we do not have, in proportionate numbers, are records of the experiments that supposedly produce the working rules. The successful techniques appear in the historical record almost fully formed, used confidently by masons who do not seem to have been the ones who developed them. This is the kind of thing that makes alternative historians get excited and conventional historians get defensive, and I want to navigate this carefully tonight, because the truth here is genuinely interesting and does not require any wild claims to be strange. The conventional explanation, which I want to take seriously first, is that Masonic knowledge was transmitted through long apprenticeships and was largely unwritten. The lodges were closed institutions. The techniques were trade secrets, held within families and guilds, taught hand to hand on actual construction sites. Of course, we do not have the development records. They were never written down. The knowledge existed in the hands and eyes of the craftsmen, not in books. This is a perfectly good explanation, and it is almost certainly part of the truth. Apprentice systems really do transmit complex tacit knowledge across generations without producing written documentation. Modern equivalents exist in everything from violin making to traditional Japanese carpentry. Craft knowledge can persist for centuries without ever appearing in print. So the absence of development records does not by itself prove anything mysterious. What it does prove is that there is an entire dimension of medieval technical capability that we cannot access directly, that we can only infer from the surviving products. And that, in turn, means we should be careful about claiming to know what medieval builders could and could not do, because our knowledge of their capabilities is filtered almost entirely through the buildings they left behind, and the buildings show us only the techniques they actually used, not the full range of what they knew. Now let me bring in something more specific: the flying buttress, that distinctive external support that allows Gothic cathedrals to have such tall, thin walls and such enormous windows, appears in the historical record around the middle of the 12th century, and it appears already mature. The earliest known examples, at places like Notre Dame in Paris, are not crude prototypes. They are confident, sophisticated structural elements that work. There is no archaeological trail of failed earlier versions. There are no surviving sketches or treatises explaining the principles. The flying buttress simply shows up, fully formed, in the work of master builders who do not explain where they got the idea. The standard account is that flying buttresses evolved gradually from earlier supporting structures, that the transition happened in buildings that have since been demolished or modified beyond recognition, that the missing intermediate forms existed but have been lost. Again, this is plausible. Buildings get demolished. Earlier versions get replaced by later versions. The archaeological record of medieval architecture is genuinely incomplete, but it is striking how many of these key innovations follow the same pattern. They appear suddenly, they appear mature. The intermediate forms are conveniently missing. The masters who use them are anonymous or barely documented. And the techniques themselves, once introduced, spread across Europe with surprising speed, faster than the standard model of slow apprentice-based transmission would seem to allow. I want to be very clear about something here, because this is exactly the kind of territory where speculation can run away from the evidence. I am not suggesting that medieval cathedrals were built by ancient astronauts, or that the masons were channeling lost Atlantean knowledge, or anything of that sort. The cathedrals were built by human beings, using human tools, drawing on human traditions of stoneworking that go back thousands of years. The Egyptians built large stone structures. The Romans built large stone structures. The Byzantines built large stone structures. The medieval European masons inherited a continuous tradition of stoneworking knowledge that stretched back into deep antiquity, and they refined it, extended it, and applied it to new architectural problems. There is no need to invoke anything supernatural to explain Chartres, or Notre Dame, or Salisbury, or Cologne. What there is need to do, however, is to acknowledge that the standard narrative of medieval Europe as a backward, technologically stunted society, slowly recovering from the fall of Rome, does not actually fit the evidence very well. The cathedral builders were operating at a level of geometric and structural sophistication that, in certain specific ways, exceeded what the formal scholarly tradition of their time could describe. They knew things they did not write down. They could do things their books did not explain how to do. The gap between official medieval knowledge and operational medieval knowledge was substantial, and that gap is where a lot of the strangeness of the period lives. And then there is the question of the symbols. Walk through any major medieval cathedral and look closely at the stonework, particularly in the less prominent areas, the bases of columns, the undersides of arches, the corners where one wall meets another, you will find marks, small carved symbols, often geometric, sometimes alphabetic, sometimes pictorial. The standard explanation is that these are masons' marks, used by individual stonecutters to identify their work for payment purposes. Each mason had a personal mark, registered with the lodge, carved into the stones he had finished, so that the foreman could count up his output at the end of the week and pay him accordingly. This is true. Masons' marks really did serve this function, and most of the marks you find in medieval cathedrals are exactly what they appear to be, accounting tools for piecework labour. But within the larger category of masons' marks, there are subcategories that do not fit this explanation cleanly. Symbols that appear in multiple cathedrals across multiple countries, used by what would have to be different masons. Symbols that show up in places where they would not be visible to a counting foreman, hidden inside walls or behind decorative elements where nobody could see them. Symbols that match, with uncomfortable precision, marks found in much older buildings, including pre-Christian ones, including buildings in regions that supposedly had no contact with the cathedrals where the marks reappear. The mainstream interpretation of these recurring symbols is that they represent the accidental convergence of simple geometric forms. There are only so many ways to combine straight lines and curves into a small distinctive mark, and patterns will inevitably repeat across unrelated traditions. Crosses, triangles, stars, spirals. These shapes are universal, and finding them in multiple unrelated contexts proves nothing. This is a reasonable position, and for most of the marks, it is probably correct. But it does not fully account for the more complex symbols, the ones that involve specific compound forms, or the ones that appear with specific orientations and proportions, or the ones that show up in clusters with the same companions. When the same 3 or 4 unusual symbols keep appearing together on cathedrals separated by hundreds of miles and decades of construction, the convergence explanation starts to feel strained. Either there was a transmission network among medieval masons that we have not fully mapped, or the symbols were drawn from a shared symbolic vocabulary that predated the cathedrals and was preserved within the Masonic tradition, or both. The honest answer is that we do not know exactly what these symbols meant or why they recur. The masons who carved them did not leave us a key. The lodges that organized the work kept their internal documents within the lodge. We are looking at the surface of a system whose deeper structure has been deliberately kept from us by the people who built it. So when you sit inside one of these cathedrals, on a cold afternoon perhaps, with the light coming through the stained glass in long coloured shafts, you are sitting inside a problem. A beautiful problem. A problem that has been carefully solved by people whose names we mostly do not know, using techniques they mostly did not write down, organized by a system whose internal logic was deliberately concealed. The standard story tells us this is just craftsmanship, just tradition, just the slow accumulation of practical experience. And it is. But it is also more than that. It is a reminder that medieval Europe contained intellectual traditions that ran parallel to the official scholarly culture of the universities and monasteries. Traditions that left their evidence in stone rather than in writing. Traditions whose internal coherence we can sense but cannot fully reconstruct. The cathedrals are not just monuments to faith. They are monuments to a kind of knowing that was not allowed, or did not bother, to speak its own name. Tonight I want to take you into the forest. Not a metaphorical forest. A real one, the way medieval Europeans understood it, because the medieval relationship with the forest is one of the most consistently mishandled topics in popular history, and once you understand what the forest actually meant to the people who lived next to it, a great many other things about the period start to make a different kind of sense. The standard image, again, is the one we inherited from 19th century romantics and 20th century fantasy novels. Dark woods full of bandits and wolves, places of danger to be avoided, the wild edge of civilization where lawful men did not go. This is not entirely wrong. There were bandits. There were wolves. The forest at night was genuinely dangerous in ways that modern people, who have never walked through real wilderness without a flashlight, do not fully appreciate. But the framing of the forest as simply a hostile space, a void at the edge of the village, misses almost everything that mattered about how medieval people actually used and understood these places. The forest, in medieval Europe, was an economic resource of staggering importance. It provided timber for construction, firewood for cooking and heating, charcoal for metalworking, mast for pigs, browse for cattle, game for the lord's table, and occasionally the peasants, herbs and roots for the village healers, bark for tanning leather, resin for sealants, honey from wild bees, nuts and berries that filled gaps in the agricultural calendar, and acorns for the autumn pannage. Whole categories of medieval economic life depended on regular access to woodland, and the legal codes of the period reflect this with extraordinary precision. There were laws about who could gather what, when, and in what quantities. There were laws about which trees could be cut, which had to be left standing, which species belonged to the lord, and which to the commons. There were laws about the rights of swine to feed in the woods during certain months, about the rights of widows to gather deadfall, about the obligations of villagers to maintain the forest paths, about the penalties for poaching the lord's deer or his rabbits or his pheasants. The forest was not a wilderness in the modern sense. It was a managed resource, intensively used, carefully regulated, and economically essential. Most medieval forests were closer to what we would now call a working woodland than to anything resembling untouched nature. The trees were coppiced. The underbrush was managed. The paths were maintained. The boundaries were marked with great care, often by stone markers or by specific old trees designated as boundary witnesses, and disputes about forest boundaries could occupy courts for generations. Now here is where it begins to get interesting, and where the official story starts to thin out. Within these managed working forests, there were specific places that were understood, by the people who lived nearby, to be different. Not metaphorically different, operationally different. There were groves you did not enter. There were springs whose water you did not drink. There were specific trees, often very old ones, that were left standing even when surrounding trees were cut. And that had a kind of legal and customary protection that nobody quite explained in writing. The mainstream interpretation of these protected sites is that they were holdovers from pre-Christian religious practice, sacred groves and sacred springs from the old paganisms that the church had officially suppressed, but that local custom continued to honor in muted forms. This is true, and it is part of the picture. The church complained about exactly this kind of practice repeatedly in penitential manuals and synodal records from at least the 6th century onward. Bishops issued decrees forbidding offerings at trees and wells. Priests gave sermons against the persistence of pagan customs in the woods. The customs persisted anyway. People kept leaving small offerings at certain trees. They kept tying ribbons to specific branches. They kept lowering coins or pins into specific springs. They did this for 1,000 years of supposed Christian dominance in nominally Christian communities, often with the quiet acceptance of the local clergy who themselves participated when they thought nobody was watching. So the standard picture is that medieval forest customs were the slowly fading echo of pre-Christian religion, and that what looks like medieval folk belief is really the late residue of Iron Age and Bronze Age practice, persisting in attenuated form because folk customs are stubborn and the church could not fully eradicate them. This is a coherent picture. It explains a lot. But it is not, I would argue, the whole story. And the parts it does not explain are worth dwelling on tonight, because they touch something genuinely strange about the medieval inner life. The persistence of forest customs is not just a matter of inertia. It is too organized, too internally consistent, too widely distributed to be simple cultural lag. The same kinds of trees get the same kinds of treatment across vast distances. Hawthorns, particularly old solitary ones standing in specific kinds of locations, get a particular set of customary protections from Ireland to the Carpathians. Yews in churchyards get a different set of protections, but ones that also recur with strange precision across cultures that supposedly developed independently. Ash trees get a third set. The customs are not random. They cluster around specific species, specific situations, specific kinds of landscape features, and they often involve very specific prohibitions about times and conditions. Do not cut this tree at all. Do not cut this tree on a Sunday. Do not cut this tree without speaking certain words first. Do not cut this tree if you are a woman. Do not cut this tree if it is in flower. Each prohibition feels arbitrary in isolation, but the system as a whole has a coherence that suggests it was once explained, that there was once a body of teaching that connected all these specific rules to a larger framework, and that the framework has been lost while the rules have survived as orphans. The medieval church understood this perfectly well, and its response is itself fascinating. Rather than simply suppressing the forest customs, which it had tried and failed to do for centuries, the medieval church increasingly absorbed them, baptized them, redirected them. Sacred trees became associated with specific saints. Sacred springs were rededicated to the Virgin or to local martyrs. Pilgrimages developed to sites that had been holy long before Christianity arrived. The famous well of St. Winifred in Wales, the well of St. Bridget in Ireland, the springs of countless French and German saints, almost all of them have pre-Christian archaeological evidence underneath them. The water was sacred long before anyone heard of the saint. The church, in its practical wisdom, did not fight this. It rebranded it. And in doing so, it preserved a layer of medieval religious experience that ran parallel to the official theology of the period, a layer that was both Christian and not Christian, both orthodox and not orthodox, depending on how closely you were willing to look. The peasant who left a coin at the well of St. Bridget in 12th century Ireland was performing a Christian act in the eyes of the church, but he was also performing an act that his great-great-grandfather had performed before St. Bridget was a saint, and that his ancestors before that had performed for reasons that the saint's hagiography does not preserve. This brings us to the small figures, the little people, the ones the legal records mention long before 19th century folklorists turned them into fairies. Across medieval Europe, there are persistent references in court records, church records, and personal testimony to encounters with small humanoid beings in the forests and fields. The church called them demons, or more cautiously, illusions. The peasants called them by dozens of regional names. The legal records, when they have to refer to them, often use careful neutral language, the people under the hill, the small folk, the ones who go quietly. These references are not confined to folk tales collected centuries later. They appear in serious legal contexts. They appear in the testimony of people on trial for theft, who claim that the goods were taken from their homes by the small folk, and who are sometimes acquitted on this basis. They appear in inheritance disputes, where a family claims that certain parcels of land cannot be cultivated because the small folk live there. They appear in midwives' testimony, in soldiers' debriefings, in monks' personal letters that were never intended for publication. The standard explanation is that medieval people genuinely believed in these beings, that the references reflect sincere folk belief rather than literal encounters, and that we should treat them as we treat any other religious or supernatural claim from the period. This is a defensible position. but it does not fully account for the consistency of the descriptions across cultures, or for the matter-of-fact tone in which these encounters are reported, or for the fact that the legal system sometimes accepted such testimony as evidence. I am not asking you to believe in fairies. I am asking you to notice something more subtle. The medieval forest, as experienced by the people who lived in and around it, was populated, not just with deer and wolves and bandits and charcoal burners. It was populated, in the perceptual experience of the people who entered it, with presences. Some of those presences were probably misidentified animals, or shadows, or the effects of fear and fatigue. Some of them were probably ergot poisoning from contaminated rye, which is a real phenomenon and which produces vivid sensory experiences that medieval observers would have had no other framework for interpreting. Some of them were probably products of social anxiety, of the way isolated rural communities concentrate their fears about the unknown into specific stories. All of these explanations are real, but they leave a residue. There is a category of medieval forest experience that does not reduce cleanly to any of these explanations, and that the people who recorded these experiences treated as a real category, as real as weather or hunger or the king. Whether we should treat it as real is a question I am not going to answer tonight, because I do not think there is an honest answer available to us. What I will say is that the medieval forest was not the empty wilderness of the modern imagination. It was a layered space, full of resources and dangers and customs and prohibitions and presences, and the people who knew it best, the foresters and charcoal burners and herbalists and woodcutters, lived with a kind of attentive carefulness that we do not have a modern word for. They walked quietly. They watched the light. They noticed when a place did not feel right, and they turned around and went a different way. And they did this not because they were superstitious or backward or primitive, but because their experience had taught them that the forest contained more than it appeared to contain, and that respect was the most efficient survival strategy. So tonight, picture this: a path through old woodland, late in the afternoon, in the year 1280. The path is well used, smooth from generations of feet. The trees on either side are managed, coppiced at regular intervals, with the seasonal regrowth at predictable heights. A man is walking this path with a load of firewood on his back. He knows every turning. He has walked it since he was a child, as his father walked it, as his grandfather walked it. At a certain bend, he slows. He always slows here. He does not exactly know why, except that everyone in the village slows here, and the people before them slowed here. And there is an old hawthorn standing slightly off the path that nobody has ever cut, even though the wood is good and the tree is on common land. He nods at the tree, almost without thinking, and continues. He does not consider himself superstitious. He considers himself practical. The custom is older than memory, and the path is still here, and the village is still here, and that, in his way of thinking, is the only argument that matters. Tonight I want to talk about something that medieval people experienced as a daily reality, but that we, in our climate-controlled, electrically lit, calorie-saturated lives, can barely imagine. I want to talk about hunger, not the casual hunger of a skipped lunch. The real, structural, civilization-shaping hunger that defined medieval European life in ways that historians have only recently begun to take seriously, and that connects, in some surprising ways, to the strangeness we have been examining throughout this exploration. Because once you understand what medieval hunger actually was, a great many phenomena that look mysterious begin to look like the natural products of a population living permanently on the edge of nutritional crisis, and a few other phenomena begin to look genuinely stranger than they did before. The basic facts are these. The medieval European diet, for the vast majority of the population, was caloric but narrow. Bread, primarily. bread of varying quality, depending on social class and region, but bread as the foundation of everything else. Below the wealthy, who ate white wheat bread, came the merchants and craftsmen, who ate mixed grain bread, and below them came the peasantry, who ate what was called maslin, a mixture of rye and barley and whatever other grains were available, often supplemented in lean years with peas, beans, or even acorns ground into flour. Bread provided most of the calories. Around the bread, depending on the season and the region and the year, came pottage, a thick boiled stew of vegetables and grains, and occasionally a scrap of meat or fish, supplemented by cheese when the household had a dairy animal, by ale, which was nutritionally important and not just recreational, and by whatever could be foraged or hunted or gathered from the common lands. Meat was rare for most people. Fresh fruit was seasonal and limited. Vegetables were dominated by the brassica family, by alliums, by root crops, by legumes. The diet was monotonous, and it was usually adequate, and it was occasionally catastrophic. The catastrophic episodes are the ones that interest us tonight, because they are where medieval Europe gets strange. A single bad harvest, in a society without significant grain storage, without rapid transportation networks, without commercial food preservation, was a regional disaster. 2 bad harvests in a row was a historical event. 3 bad harvests in a row, which happened with some regularity, was a population reshaping catastrophe. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which preceded the Black Death by a generation, killed somewhere between 5 and 12% of the population of Northern Europe, depending on which estimates you trust. Whole regions saw their grain prices increase by factors of 5 or 10. Mortality records from the period describe parents abandoning children, communities resorting to consumption of carrion and worse, and a kind of psychological breakdown in social structures that contemporary observers struggle to describe. The chronicles of the period record events that historians use to dismiss as moralistic exaggeration, but that have, in recent decades, increasingly been treated as straightforward reporting. People did eat the bark of trees. People did dig up corpses. People did, in the most extreme circumstances, eat each other. The records are clear and they are repeated across multiple independent sources, and the modern instinct to soften them is, I think, a kind of unintended condescension toward the people who lived through these events. They were telling us what happened. We should believe them. But this is the hunger that historians can quantify, the famines that show up in the records as crises, the events that contemporary observers recognized as exceptional. Underneath these episodic catastrophes ran a permanent baseline of low-grade malnutrition that was simply the normal condition of medieval life for most people. Modern paleopathological studies of medieval skeletal remains reveal evidence of childhood nutritional stress in the majority of the population. Lines of arrested growth in the long bones, enamel hyperplasia in the teeth, the little horizontal grooves that form when a child's nutrition is severely disrupted, signs of scurvy, of rickets, of anemia. The average height of medieval Europeans was significantly lower than it had been in the early Roman period, and significantly lower than it would be again after the agricultural improvements of the 18th century. Most medieval adults had survived multiple episodes of malnutrition during their growth years, and their bodies carried the permanent record of it. This had consequences that go beyond the simply medical. A chronically undernourished population thinks differently, perceives differently, dreams differently, behaves differently than a well-fed one. And this is where the hunger connects to some of the strangest recorded phenomena of the medieval period. Consider the dancing plagues. There are several of these in the historical record, the most famous being the outbreak in Strasbourg in July of 1518, which falls just outside our medieval period strictly defined, but which fits perfectly within the cultural pattern that interests us. A woman named Frau Troffea began dancing in the street. She did not stop. Within a week, dozens of others had joined her. Within a month, the count was somewhere between 50 and 400 people, depending on the source, dancing continuously in the streets of Strasbourg, many of them collapsing from exhaustion, some of them dying from heart attacks or strokes or simple overheating. The civic authorities, in their bafflement, initially tried to encourage the dancing, hiring musicians and clearing public spaces, on the theory that dancing it out would resolve the condition. This made things worse. Eventually, the dancers were taken to a shrine of Saint Vitus, who was associated with such conditions, and the outbreak gradually subsided. This is the most documented case, but similar episodes occur throughout the medieval period. There is one in Aachen in 1374, which spread along the Rhine and affected thousands of people across multiple cities. There are smaller outbreaks scattered across the chronicles, often associated with churches or shrines, often involving women more than men, often occurring in the warm months after a spring of food shortages. The mainstream explanations are several, and they are not necessarily exclusive. Ergot poisoning from contaminated rye can produce the kind of muscle spasms and altered consciousness that might look like compulsive dancing. Mass psychogenic illness, where psychological stress in a tight-knit community produces shared physical symptoms, is a well-documented phenomenon in modern populations and was almost certainly a factor. Religious enthusiasm, where the cultural framework available for interpreting strange experiences was specifically shaped by Christian categories of possession and divine intervention, would have channeled whatever was happening into specific behavioral patterns. Each of these explanations covers part of the territory. Ergot was probably involved in some of the cases, but not all. Mass psychogenic illness explains the social spread, but not the initial onset. Religious framing shaped the experience, but did not cause it. The honest position is that the dancing plagues were probably a combination of physical, psychological, and cultural factors, and that the relative weights of these factors varied from outbreak to outbreak. But notice what underlies all of these explanations. A population already weakened by malnutrition, a culture saturated with religious imagery of suffering and ecstasy, a social structure that had no concept of mental illness as we understand it, and that interpreted altered states through frameworks of possession or divine visitation. The dancing plagues were not random eruptions of strangeness. They were what happened when a chronically stressed population encountered specific triggers, and the form the response took was shaped by everything else we have been discussing tonight. There is another phenomenon from this period that I want to bring into the picture because it connects in interesting ways. The visions. Medieval Europe produced an enormous quantity of recorded religious visionary experience. Saints had visions. Mystics had visions. Ordinary peasants occasionally had visions, and some of those visions became the foundation for major shrines and pilgrimage sites. The church had a complicated relationship with these experiences. It needed some of them to be real because the legitimacy of certain saints and certain doctrines depended on visionary confirmation. It needed others to be false because false visions could undermine orthodoxy and challenge ecclesiastical authority. Elaborate procedures developed for distinguishing genuine visions from delusions or demonic deceptions, and these procedures were applied with varying degrees of seriousness depending on the political circumstances. What we can say, looking at the visions in aggregate, is that medieval Europeans had a significantly higher rate of recorded visionary experience than modern populations do, and that this difference is probably real, not just a matter of recording bias. Something about the conditions of medieval life produced more visions, more mystical experiences, more encounters with what the experiencers understood as the divine or the demonic. Here is the connection I want to draw. A chronically malnourished population with periodic episodes of severe food restriction, living in a culture of intense religious imagery, with significant baseline disease burden, in long dark winters with limited stimulation, sleeping in biphasic patterns with extended waking periods in the middle of the night, often consuming psychoactive substances in their bread without knowing it. This is a population that would be expected, on purely physiological grounds, to have a high rate of altered states of consciousness. The visions are not surprising. The dancing plagues are not surprising. The reports of forest encounters with small folk are not, in this context, surprising either. The medieval mind was operating in a brain that was differently nourished, differently rested, differently exposed to environmental conditions than ours. We should expect medieval consciousness to produce phenomena that ours does not. The interesting question is not whether these experiences happened, because clearly they did, and the records are too consistent to dismiss. The interesting question is what proportion of them were entirely interior, products of the brain interacting with itself under unusual conditions, and what proportion of them were responses to something genuinely present in the medieval environment that modern conditions have made invisible to us. I do not know the answer to that question, and neither does anyone else. The honest position is that medieval consciousness was so different from modern consciousness in its inputs and its frameworks and its physical substrate that we cannot reliably map our experience onto theirs. They saw things we do not see. Some of what they saw was probably interior. Some of what they saw was probably real environmental phenomena that modern infrastructure has eliminated: ergot in the rye, lead in the water, parasites in the meat, contaminants in the well. And some small residue of what they saw, perhaps, was something else entirely, something we do not have good categories for, something that the conditions of their lives made perceptible to them, and that the conditions of our lives have rendered imperceptible to us. I am not going to argue for that last category tonight. I am only going to note that ruling it out entirely requires a confidence in our own perceptual completeness that I do not think the evidence supports. So picture this, before we close. A village in late February. The grain stores are low, but not yet empty. The bread has been stretched with bean flour and acorn meal for 6 weeks already. The cold has not broken. A woman wakes during her second sleep, in the middle of the night, in the long, quiet hour when medieval Europe was simultaneously most awake and most strange. The fire in the hearth is low. She sits up. She thinks she sees something at the foot of her bed, a figure, brief and flickering, that is gone before she can focus on it. She crosses herself and lies back down. She does not tell anyone in the morning, because such things are common, and one does not invite the attention of what one saw by speaking of it carelessly. But she remembers it for the rest of her life, and on her deathbed, 60 years later, she will mention it to her granddaughter, who will mention it to her own granddaughter, and somewhere in the slow currents of folklore, the figure at the foot of the bed will become a story, and the story will become a custom, and the custom will become a small carved mark above the doorway of a house in a village whose name has not yet been written down. Tonight I want to take you into the medieval mind through a side door that most popular histories never open. I want to talk about what medieval people actually believed about time. Not the calendar exactly, though the calendar is part of it. I want to talk about the deeper structure of time as the medieval mind perceived it, because once you understand that medieval Europeans did not experience time the way we do, a great many of their behaviors that look superstitious or irrational from a modern perspective begin to look like reasonable responses to a very different temporal universe. And this, in turn, opens onto some of the strangest puzzles we have been circling around all night. The standard modern model of time is linear, uniform, and indifferent. 1 second is the same as any other second. Time flows forward at a constant rate. The past is fixed and unrecoverable. The future is open and unknown. The clock measures something real and consistent, the same in every location and under every circumstance. This is the model we inherited from Newton and the Industrial Revolution, and it is so deeply embedded in modern consciousness that we have to make a deliberate effort to imagine that it could be otherwise. But the medieval model of time was none of these things. Medieval time was layered, qualitative, and saturated with meaning. Different hours had different characters. Different days had different powers. Different seasons opened different kinds of doors. The same physical interval, measured in modern minutes, could feel like an eternity or a flicker, depending on when in the cycle it occurred and what was happening in the heavens at the time. Medieval time was, in a precise sense, a participant in events rather than merely a stage on which events occurred. And the medieval understanding of how to live well, how to plan, how to work, how to pray, how to avoid disaster, was inseparable from a sophisticated practical knowledge of when the various qualities of time would be present. Let me start with the most basic level of this. The medieval day was divided not into 24 equal hours, but into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of night, with the length of each hour varying by season. A summer hour of daylight in Northern Europe was significantly longer than a winter hour of daylight. A summer hour of night was significantly shorter than a winter hour of night. These were not approximations or conveniences. They were the official hours of the canonical liturgy, marked by bells from the monasteries and parish churches, structuring the working day for everyone within earshot. Prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, matins, lauds. These were not abstract divisions. They were specific moments with specific spiritual qualities, prayed for centuries by specific communities, embedded in the rhythm of agricultural and craft labor, in ways that made medieval time feel substantially different from the uniform tick of mechanical clocks. When mechanical clocks began to spread across Europe in the late 13th and 14th centuries, they encountered active resistance, not just from the institutional church, but from ordinary working people, who recognized that something important was being taken from them. The new uniform hours flattened the qualitative texture of the day. They imposed a single rhythm on activities that had previously had their own rhythms. They allowed work to be measured and bought and sold in a way that had not previously been possible. The mechanical clock was, among other things, the technological precondition for industrial labor, and the medieval suspicion of it was not irrational nostalgia. It was a recognition that a certain kind of human freedom was about to end. But the layering of time went much deeper than the daily liturgical hours. The medieval calendar was a complex superimposition of multiple cycles, each of which had its own logic and its own qualities. There was the agricultural cycle, anchored to the solstices and equinoxes, and to the major saints' days that marked planting, lambing, harvesting, slaughtering. There was the liturgical cycle of fasts and feasts, which moved according to its own rules and which had different rhythms for different regions and different orders within the church. There was the legal cycle, with its terms and quarter days and rent payment dates, which structured the economic life of villages and towns. There was the astrological cycle, which was taken entirely seriously by medieval people across all classes, including by physicians who would not bleed a patient or administer a medicine without consulting the position of the planets and the phase of the moon. And there was the deeper cycle of what we might call sacred time, the recurrence of moments when the ordinary rules of the universe were understood to thin or shift, when the boundary between this world and other realms became more porous, when actions taken had consequences that extended beyond the immediate. This last category is the one that most interests us tonight, because it connects to some of the strangest and most persistent patterns in medieval folk practice. Certain nights of the year were universally recognized across the breadth of medieval Europe as nights when the ordinary fabric of reality was different. The Eve of All Saints, which we now call Halloween, was one such night when the dead were understood to return and when the boundaries between the living and the departed thinned. The Eve of May Day was another, when other kinds of presences were understood to be active and when specific protective customs were observed. Midsummer Eve, the night before St. John's Day, was a third, associated with bonfires, with herb gathering, with divinatory practices that the Church officially disapproved of and that nearly everyone practiced anyway. Christmas Eve, despite its Christian framing, retained an underlayer of older meaning, a sense that the night when the year turned was a night when other things turned as well. These were not random selections. They cluster around the cardinal points of the solar year, with adjustments for the lunar calendar and for specific Christian feasts that had been overlaid on older dates. The medieval understanding was that the universe had a rhythm, that the rhythm had hinges, and that at the hinges, things that were normally hidden became briefly visible or active. The mainstream interpretation of all this is straightforward. Medieval people inherited a complex of pre-Christian seasonal customs. The Church partially absorbed and partially overlaid these customs with its own calendar. The resulting hybrid was internally inconsistent but culturally functional, and the persistence of pre-Christian elements within nominally Christian observances reflects the slow, incomplete process of religious transformation rather than any genuine perceptual access to non-ordinary realities. This is a defensible position, and as with so many of the topics we have examined tonight, it is partially correct. The seasonal customs were inherited. The hybrid was real. The religious transformation was incomplete. None of this is in dispute. What is in dispute, or what should be in dispute if we were being honest about it, is whether the underlying perceptions that the customs were responding to are reducible to cultural inheritance, or whether the customs persisted because they were tracking something real about the temporal environment that pre-modern populations could perceive, and modern populations cannot. I want to be careful here, because I am not making a metaphysical claim. I am making a perceptual one. Consider that we know, with certainty, that medieval people lived in a sensory environment dramatically different from ours. They lived in deeper darkness. The night sky in medieval Europe was a thing of overwhelming visual intensity, with the Milky Way clearly visible from any village, with planetary movements obvious to any observer, with comets and aurorae and meteors all unmistakable events that signified something. They lived in deeper silence. The ambient noise floor in a medieval village at night was so low that conversation could be heard from significant distances, and the sound of an unfamiliar footstep would wake everyone in a household. They lived in deeper biological connection with their surroundings. They knew which plants flowered when, which birds returned in which weeks, which weather patterns followed which signs. They lived in deeper temporal embeddedness, with no clocks to override the natural rhythms of their bodies, and no electric light to extend their days artificially. The conditions of medieval perception were so different from ours that we should expect medieval people to have noticed things we cannot notice, simply because they were paying attention to dimensions of experience that we have lost access to. When medieval people said that certain nights felt different, that certain hours had a particular quality, that certain seasons opened certain kinds of possibilities, they were probably not making metaphysical claims in the way we would understand them. They were reporting perceptions. The perceptions were embedded in cultural frameworks that interpreted them religiously, but the perceptions themselves were grounded in observation of a sensory environment that we have systematically degraded through artificial light, mechanical clocks, climate control, and the general insulation of modern life from natural cycles. We have lost the perceptual access that medieval people had. They could feel things in the texture of time that we cannot feel, not because they had different brains, but because they had different inputs. And the customs they developed in response to these perceptions encoded a kind of practical wisdom, that we have largely discarded as superstition, without ever asking whether the discarding was a gain or a loss. Now let me push this a little further, into territory that requires more caution. There is a category of medieval claim about time that goes beyond what I have just described, that is harder to reduce to differences in perceptual environment. Certain medieval texts describe experiences of time that seem to involve actual distortions of duration. Reports of pilgrims who entered a chapel for what felt like a few minutes of prayer and emerged to find that an entire night had passed. Reports of travelers who took shelter in a particular wood for what they experienced as a single afternoon and emerged to find that days or weeks had elapsed in the outside world. Reports of mystics who experienced moments of vision that contained, in their subjective experience, vast quantities of content, entire teachings, whole landscapes of understanding, compressed into instants of clock time. The Church handled these reports carefully, sometimes endorsing them as miracles, sometimes condemning them as delusions, depending on the orthodoxy of the experiencer and the political circumstances. The folk tradition handled them more matter-of-factly, integrating them into the broader category of what happens at the edges of certain places and certain hours. The mainstream interpretation is that these are subjective distortions, the kind of altered time perception that occurs in dreams, in trance states, in mystical experiences, in conditions of intense focus or intense fatigue. This is almost certainly the correct explanation for most of these reports. The brain's sense of duration is famously plastic, and there is no need to invoke any actual distortion of objective time to explain the subjective experiences. But it is worth noting how widespread and how consistent these reports are across medieval Europe, and how often they cluster around specific kinds of locations. Old churches, particularly ones built on older sacred sites, specific groves and springs, certain mountain caves. The pattern is too regular to be entirely random, even if every individual case can be explained by ordinary psychology. Either there is something about these specific locations that reliably produces altered states in susceptible visitors, perhaps through environmental factors we have not fully identified, perhaps through the simple expectation effect of approaching a place known for such experiences, or there is something else going on that we do not have good frameworks for. I'm not going to claim to know which. I'm going to note that the medieval response to such places was a kind of practical respect, a willingness to acknowledge that not all locations operate by the same rules. That came from cumulative experience rather than from theory. So as you let yourself drift now, hold this image gently. A bell tower in a small town, ringing the hour of compline on a winter evening. The bell is bronze, cast 100 years before the listener was born, marked with the inscription of its founder, and with a small cross, and with something else, a symbol the listener does not recognize, but that has always been there. The sound of the bell is not just an acoustic event, it is a marker in the day, a known quality of time, a moment that has been the same for generations, and that will be the same for generations more. The listener stops what they are doing, they cross themselves. They feel, in some way they could not articulate if you ask them, that this exact moment has a particular weight, that things done now have a different consequence than the same things done 2 hours earlier or 2 hours later, that the bell is not measuring time so much as participating in it. They are not wrong about this. They are perceiving something we no longer perceive, and they are responding to it with the carefulness it deserves. Tonight, I want to take you into one of the strangest categories of medieval evidence, the kind of evidence that historians find genuinely uncomfortable because it does not fit neatly into the standard frameworks we have for thinking about the period. I want to talk about medieval maps. Specifically, I want to talk about the things on medieval maps that should not be there. Because once you start looking carefully at the cartographic record of the period, you begin to notice that certain medieval maps contain information that the official history of medieval geographic knowledge says they could not have contained, and the explanations we have for this are interesting precisely because they keep failing to fully cover the evidence. Let me start with the basic picture. Medieval European maps fall into several broad categories. There are the schematic religious maps, the so-called T and O maps, which divide the world into 3 continents arranged around a central point, usually Jerusalem, with no pretense of geographic accuracy. These are theological diagrams more than navigation tools, and nobody serious has ever expected them to be cartographically reliable. Then there are the more detailed Mappae Mundi, the great world maps of the high medieval period, like the Hereford Mappa Mundi or the Ebstorf map, which combine geographic information with biblical narrative, classical mythology, and bestiary illustrations into elaborate visual encyclopedias. These maps include real places, but they include them alongside legendary ones, with no clear distinction made between them. Jerusalem sits at the center. The earthly paradise is shown in the east, beyond India. Gog and Magog are sealed up behind their wall in the north. Monsters and marvels populate the edges. These maps are not navigation tools either. They are visual theology, meditations on the shape of creation, as understood through scripture and tradition. To call them inaccurate is to misunderstand what they were trying to do. But there is a third category of medieval map, and this is where things get interesting. The Portolan charts. These appear in the historical record around the late 13th century, primarily in the Mediterranean trading cities of Genoa, Venice, Majorca, and the Catalan ports. Unlike the Mappae Mundi, the Portolan charts are working navigation tools, drawn on parchment, used by actual sailors to find their way around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea and along the Atlantic coast of Europe and Africa. And here is the puzzle. The Portolan charts are dramatically more accurate than they have any right to be. The coastlines, particularly of the Mediterranean, are rendered with a precision that the official medieval understanding of mathematics and surveying simply cannot account for. The proportions are correct, the angles are correct, the relative positions of ports are correct to within a degree or two. These maps look, to a modern eye, like the products of sustained systematic survey work conducted by people who knew how to triangulate distances and how to correct for magnetic variation and how to record observations in a standardized way. And yet, the official history says that nobody in medieval Europe had these capabilities. The mainstream explanation for the Portolan charts is that they emerged gradually through the cumulative experience of generations of Mediterranean sailors, that the charts represent the synthesis of countless individual voyages, that the apparent accuracy is the product of trial and error rather than systematic survey. This is a reasonable position, and it is almost certainly part of the truth. Sailors really did keep notes. They really did share information at ports. The maritime cultures of the medieval Mediterranean really did accumulate practical geographic knowledge over time. What this explanation does not quite address is the suddenness of the appearance. The Portolan charts do not show a long evolution from cruder forms to more accurate ones. The earliest surviving examples, from the late 13th century, are already remarkably accurate. They appear, like the flying buttress, mature. The intermediate forms are conveniently missing. And the accuracy itself, when modern researchers have tried to reproduce it, using only the techniques supposedly available in the medieval Mediterranean, turns out to be very difficult to achieve. Reconstructing a Portolan chart from scratch, using only 13th century instruments and methods, is an exercise that has been attempted multiple times by maritime historians, and the results consistently fall short of the actual historical charts. Either the medieval sailors had techniques we have not fully reconstructed, or they were drawing on sources we have not fully identified, or both. Now, here is where the alternative interpretations begin, and I want to walk through them carefully because some are more defensible than others. The first and most modest alternative is that the Portolan charts drew on lost classical sources. The ancient world, particularly the Hellenistic and Roman periods, produced sophisticated geographic knowledge that we know existed because it is referenced in surviving texts. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy in the 3rd century before Christ. Ptolemy, in the 2nd century after Christ, produced a geography that included coordinates for thousands of locations, organized in a coherent mathematical framework. Most of this knowledge was lost to medieval Europe, surviving only in Arabic translations and in fragmentary references in late antique authors. But it was not lost everywhere. The Byzantine Empire preserved much of it. The Islamic world preserved much of it. And the trading cities of the medieval Mediterranean, particularly the Italian ones, were in regular contact with both. The Portolan charts may represent, in this view, the rediscovery and adaptation of classical geographic knowledge that had survived in the Eastern Mediterranean and that was reintroduced to Latin Europe through the trade and diplomatic networks of the High Medieval period. This is a perfectly respectable explanation, and it is probably true in part. The Portolans certainly do reflect classical influences, and the renaissance of classical learning in this period was real. But the Portolan question becomes more interesting when we look at certain specific later maps that build on the Portolan tradition, and that contain features even harder to explain. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, is the most famous of these. It shows the coast of South America and, in some interpretations, parts of the coast of Antarctica, drawn with sufficient detail that it is difficult to dismiss as artistic invention. The map includes a marginal note in which Piri Reis explicitly states that he compiled it from 20 older charts, including some that had belonged to Christopher Columbus and some that dated from the time of Alexander the Great. This is the cartographer's own claim, not a modern speculation. He believed he was working from sources that included material older than the medieval period itself. The mainstream interpretation is that Piri Reis was either mistaken about his sources or that the apparent accuracy of certain coastlines is coincidental, the result of generic coastline shapes that happen to resemble real geography. The alternative interpretations have ranged from the reasonable that pre-Columbian voyages to the Americas were more numerous and better documented than orthodox history admits, to the highly speculative that ancient civilizations possess geographic knowledge that has been almost entirely erased from the record. I am not going to argue for either of these tonight. I am going to note that the standard explanation, that Piri Reis simply made up or imagined the parts that fit modern coastlines, requires us to dismiss the cartographer's own statements about his sources, and that this dismissal is more confident than the evidence really supports. There is a smaller and stranger category of medieval cartographic puzzle that I want to bring in here, because it is less famous than the Piri Reis map, but in some ways more interesting. The Vinland map, which surfaced in the mid-20th century, and which appears to show a portion of the North American coast labelled as a known Norse landfall, has been the subject of decades of dispute. The chemical analysis of its ink has been argued to be inconsistent with medieval production. The provenance is unclear. Most scholars now consider it a forgery, though the case is not entirely closed. Whether or not the Vinland map is genuine, what it points to is a separate and well-documented historical reality. The Norse really did reach North America. The archaeological evidence at Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland is unambiguous. They had a settlement there for some period of time, and they likely explored the coast more widely than the surviving sagas record. And the medieval Icelandic and Greenlandic communities maintained at least intermittent knowledge of these western lands for centuries after the initial voyages. The question is, what happened to that knowledge? Did it remain confined to the North Atlantic communities, or did it filter, through trade and diplomatic contact, into the broader cartographic traditions of medieval Europe? The official answer is that it remained largely confined, that mainstream medieval European geographic knowledge did not include reliable information about the Americas before the late 15th century. But there are scattered hints in earlier sources, references to islands far to the west, place names that do not match any known Atlantic features, traditions about lands accessible from the western reaches of the European fisheries, that suggest something more complicated may have been going on. What I want to draw your attention to, as we sit with all of this, is a pattern that runs through medieval cartographic evidence as a whole. The official picture is one of geographic ignorance gradually giving way to discovery. Medieval Europeans, in this view, knew their own continent reasonably well, knew the Mediterranean very well, had vague and largely fantastical ideas about the more distant parts of Asia and Africa, and had essentially no reliable knowledge of the Americas or the Pacific or the southern continents until the great voyages of exploration in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The maps produced before that point reflect this limited knowledge, and the maps produced after begin to fill in the blanks as exploration provides new information. This picture is broadly correct, and the great majority of medieval maps fit within it without difficulty. What does not fit cleanly are certain specific anomalous features on certain specific maps, the unexpected accuracy of the Portolan charts, the suspicious confidence of certain coastline renderings on later maps that are supposedly compiled from older sources, the persistent rumors and references in medieval texts to places and lands that orthodox geography says were unknown. These anomalies are individually small. None of them, by itself, requires us to rewrite the history of medieval geographic knowledge. But they accumulate. They form a pattern of small irregularities that, taken together, suggest that the picture of medieval geographic ignorance may be slightly too tidy. The honest position, I think, is that medieval European geographic knowledge was probably more layered and more complicated than the standard narrative allows, that some classical geographic knowledge survived in fragmentary form and influenced later medieval cartography in ways that are difficult to fully reconstruct, that the maritime cultures of the Mediterranean and the North Atlantic accumulated significant practical knowledge that was transmitted through informal channels and that left traces in the cartographic record, and that some specific maps contain features that we genuinely do not have good explanations for. The space between the orthodox account and the more speculative alternatives is a space of genuine historiographical uncertainty, and the appropriate response to that uncertainty is not to choose a side, but to hold the questions open. Did medieval Europeans know more about the world than the standard story admits? Probably yes, in some specific ways, though probably not as much as the most enthusiastic alternative theorists claim. Were there geographic traditions running parallel to the official scholarly cartography, transmitted within trading communities and maritime guilds, and possibly within other networks we have not yet identified? Almost certainly yes, though the details are largely lost to us. Are there pieces of evidence that we have not yet figured out how to explain? Yes, and the appropriate scholarly response to those pieces is sustained attention rather than premature dismissal. Picture this, before we close. A small room in a Genoese trading house, late in the 13th century. A man is working at a tilted drawing table by the light of an oil lamp. He is copying a chart. The chart he is copying is older than he is, perhaps older than his father was. It came from his father's master, who had it from a Sicilian, who had it from a Greek, who had it from somewhere further east that he did not entirely understand. The chart shows the coastlines of the Mediterranean with extraordinary precision. It also shows, in its margins, certain notations the copyist does not fully understand, marks indicating windroses and current patterns and the locations of certain reefs, written in a shorthand that has been used by his trade for longer than anyone remembers. He copies the marks faithfully. He does not need to understand them. The men who will use this chart at sea will know what they mean. The knowledge is older than its current users, transmitted through hands that did not necessarily read the texts that supposedly contain the geographic knowledge of the age, preserved in objects rather than in books. And somewhere in those margins, perhaps, sits a small piece of information that came from a voyage nobody recorded, made by sailors whose names were never written down, to a coast that the official maps of the period do not yet show. And that small piece of information, that fragment in the margin of a chart copied by an anonymous Genoese hand, points us toward the next thread we need to follow. And that small piece of information, that fragment in the margin of a chart copied by an anonymous Genoese hand, points us toward the next thread we need to follow tonight. Because the question of how knowledge actually moved through medieval Europe, who carried it, in what form, by what routes, and through what kinds of people, turns out to be one of the most consistently underestimated dimensions of the period. We have been talking about cathedrals built by masons whose techniques were not in books, about charts that contain information their official cartographers should not have possessed, about forest customs preserved across centuries by people who could not read. What ties all of these together is a vast informal network of transmission that ran parallel to the formal institutions of medieval life, and it is into that network that I want to take you now. The official picture of medieval knowledge transmission is centered on the institutions we can easily document. The monastic scriptoria, where texts were copied by hand and preserved across generations. The cathedral schools, which gradually evolved into the first universities at Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and elsewhere. The royal and ecclesiastical administrations, which produced the charters and registers and legal codes that fill the medieval archives. The mendicant orders, which carried theological and philosophical knowledge across Europe through their networks of houses and their itinerant preachers. All of this is real, and all of it has been thoroughly studied. The history of medieval Latin scholarship can be traced in considerable detail because it left written records, and the written records are exactly what historians are equipped to study. The problem is that this carefully documented stream of formal knowledge was, in practice, a small minority of what was actually moving through medieval Europe. Most knowledge moved through other channels, channels that left no archive, channels that were specifically designed to be invisible to the institutions that we now use as our window onto the period. Consider the merchants. The medieval merchant, particularly the long-distance merchant of the high medieval period, was a figure of extraordinary cognitive complexity. He had to know the geography of his trade routes in detail that no map could fully capture, including the political conditions of every territory he passed through, the customs and taxes of every jurisdiction, the languages and dialects of every region, the reliable inns and the dangerous stretches and the seasonal patterns of brigandage. He had to know the commodities of his trade with a precision that bordered on the encyclopedic, including how to assess quality, how to detect adulteration, how to estimate weights and measures across the wildly inconsistent local systems, how to convert between dozens of currencies, and how to recognize counterfeit coinage from any of them. He had to know mathematics, including the new arithmetic with Hindu-Arabic numerals that was spreading through Italy in the late medieval period, and that gave its users an enormous practical advantage over those still using Roman numerals for calculation. He had to know enough law to navigate the contracts and partnerships that financed his ventures, enough astronomy to manage his timing and navigation, enough medicine to keep himself and his goods alive on long journeys, and enough diplomacy to handle interactions with everyone from petty officials to foreign princes. None of this knowledge was acquired in a university. Almost none of it was written down in any systematic way. It was transmitted through apprenticeship, through observation, through the accumulated experience of merchant families and merchant guilds, and it was guarded carefully because it was the basis of competitive advantage. The successful medieval merchant was an extraordinarily well-informed person, by any standard, and the information he carried was largely inaccessible to anyone outside his trade. The same was true of the sailors. The same was true of the smiths and the dyers and the glassmakers and the apothecaries. Each of these crafts maintained its own internal body of practical knowledge, transmitted through apprenticeship, protected by guild secrecy, often involving techniques that the formal scholarly culture of the period either ignored or actively misunderstood. The dyers of Florence and Bruges produced colours using processes that involved complex chemistry, including the famous and jealously guarded technique for producing the deep blue from woad and the brilliant red from kermes and madder, and, eventually, from the New World cochineal. The metalworkers of southern Germany and northern Italy produced steel of varying carbon content using methods that they could replicate reliably, but could not have explained in the chemical terms we now use. The apothecaries of every major town maintained pharmacopoeias that combined classical Galenic medicine with local herbal traditions and with substances acquired from astonishingly distant trade networks. Mumia from Egypt, Tutti from Persia, ambergris from the Atlantic, theriac from Venice that contained dozens of ingredients including viper flesh and was prepared according to elaborate ritualized procedures. The medieval working knowledge of materials and processes was vastly more sophisticated than the medieval written knowledge of these things, and the gap between them was deliberate, maintained for economic and social reasons that the practitioners understood perfectly well. This is the context in which we need to place the figure who has hovered in the background of everything we have discussed tonight without quite stepping forward. The wandering scholar, the wandering craftsman, the wandering healer. Medieval Europe contained, in numbers we cannot precisely quantify, but that were certainly substantial, a population of people who moved continuously across the landscape, carrying knowledge between communities, connecting networks that would otherwise have remained separate. Some of these were clerics, the famous Goliards and Vagantes, who moved between universities and cathedral chapters, sometimes in trouble with their bishops, sometimes employed by them as discreet messengers. Some were craftsmen on their Wanderjahre, the journeyman years that the guilds required between apprenticeship and mastery, during which young men travelled from town to town, picking up regional variations of their trade. Some were merchants and their factors. Some were pilgrims, and the pilgrim routes were major arteries of cultural and informational exchange, not just spiritual journeys. Some were soldiers and mercenaries, including the various crusading orders and the free companies of the later medieval period, who carried back from the eastern Mediterranean and from the Iberian frontier all manner of practical and theoretical material that found its way into European intellectual life by routes that the universities did not always notice. And some were figures harder to categorize, the cunning men and wise women of the rural districts, the bone setters and midwives and herbalists who served populations that had no other access to medical care, who maintained traditions of knowledge that combined practical empirical observation with elements of much older systems of belief. What unites all of these mobile figures is that they were the principal mechanism by which information actually moved across medieval Europe, and that the information they moved was substantially different from the information being copied in the monasteries. They carried news, of course, but they also carried techniques. A new method for tempering steel, learned in Toledo, could appear in a workshop in Liège within a few years through the movement of a single skilled craftsman. A new herbal remedy, observed in a village in the Carpathians, could spread through the wise women of Central Europe within a generation, through the slow word-of-mouth networks that connected practitioners. A new architectural detail, admired in a cathedral in Reims, could appear in a parish church in Yorkshire within a decade through the movement of master masons between projects. None of this transmission shows up in the formal documentary record. It shows up only in the artifacts themselves, in the buildings and tools and texts that have survived, where the historian who looks carefully can see the same techniques appearing in places that the official channels of communication did not connect. This matters enormously for how we should understand the strange phenomena we have been discussing throughout this exploration. When we encounter a mysterious symbol on cathedrals separated by hundreds of miles, we should not assume that there must have been a single secret organization deliberately spreading it. We should consider that the masons who carved these symbols moved between projects, that they shared a craft tradition older than any of the buildings, and that the symbols may simply have been a normal element of their working vocabulary that we no longer have the key to read. When we encounter a folk custom preserved across the breadth of Europe with surprising consistency, we should not assume that it must derive from some single ancient source transmitted through an unbroken chain of secret teachers. We should consider that the rural population of medieval Europe was more mobile and more interconnected than the standard image of village isolation suggests, that wise women and cunning men talked to each other when they met at fairs and markets and pilgrimage sites, that the customs persisted not because they were preserved by a hidden few, but because they were genuinely useful and continuously reaffirmed by the practical experience of generations. And when we encounter a piece of geographic information on a chart that should not have been available to its makers, we should consider that the maritime communities of medieval Europe contained sailors who had been places that the formal records do not mention, who had spoken to other sailors from even more distant places, and who had quietly added their observations to charts that were copied and recopied without anyone bothering to note who contributed which detail. The medieval informal information network was not a conspiracy, in other words. It was something both more mundane and more interesting than a conspiracy. It was the natural product of a society in which most useful knowledge was held outside the institutions that produced our archives, in which the people who carried that knowledge had practical reasons to share it selectively rather than to publish it openly, and in which the slow movements of merchants and craftsmen and pilgrims and soldiers and wandering scholars added up, over generations, to a continuous redistribution of practical wisdom across the entire continent. The institutions we use to study the medieval period, the monasteries and universities and royal chanceries, were largely cut off from this network, sometimes deliberately, sometimes simply because they had no use for the kinds of knowledge it carried. When a Cistercian abbot wrote about the year 1200, he wrote about the things that mattered to him, the affairs of his order and his patrons, and the theological controversies of his time. He did not write about the iron production techniques being used in the lay brother forges that funded his abbey, even though those techniques represented a more significant body of knowledge than most of what he did write down. We have his theological treatises. We do not have a single technical manual from his forge. And so, when we reconstruct the medieval period from the sources he and his colleagues left us, we get a picture that is necessarily skewed toward the concerns of the literate clerical elite and away from the actual operating knowledge of the society that elite was embedded in. Once you internalize this asymmetry, the strangeness of the medieval period begins to organize itself differently. The mysteries are not necessarily mysteries because medieval people had access to forbidden knowledge or supernatural powers. They are mysteries because the people who had the relevant knowledge did not write it down, and the people who did the writing did not have the relevant knowledge. The gap between what was known and what was recorded was vast, and the strangeness we encounter when we examine the medieval record is largely a function of trying to look through a small set of windows at a much larger room. The room was full. We can see only the corners that the windows happen to look out onto. And every so often, when we examine a surviving artifact carefully, we catch a glimpse of what was happening in the parts of the room that the writers never described, and we are surprised because we had built our picture of the room from the windows alone. This brings us, naturally, to a related and more troubling question, which I want to begin to approach as we move toward the next thread of our exploration. If so much medieval knowledge moved through informal networks, and if those networks left so little documentary trace, then how would we know if some of that knowledge had been lost? How would we know if entire bodies of practical or theoretical understanding had simply disappeared, taken to the grave by their last practitioners, never recorded because the people who held them had no incentive to record them, and the people who recorded things had no interest in writing them down? The answer, uncomfortable as it is that we mostly would not know. We would only see the absence indirectly, in the form of phenomena that the surviving record cannot adequately explain, in techniques that appear and disappear without leaving a trail, in references to things that the medieval writers mention casually, as if everyone knew about them and that we now find impossible to identify. And the evidence of these absences, the negative space of medieval knowledge, is one of the most fascinating and least studied dimensions of the period. There are entire categories of medieval understanding that we know existed only because we can see the shape of where they used to be. The shape of those absences becomes most visible when you start cataloguing the references that medieval writers make in passing, the casual mentions of things they assume their readers will recognize, the offhand allusions to practices and substances and techniques that they do not bother to explain, because explanation would be unnecessary. And it is in this category of casual reference, more than in any explicit treatise, that we can begin to map the contours of what medieval Europe knew and has since forgotten. Tonight, I want to walk you through some of these absences because they tell us something important about the limits of what can be reconstructed from the historical record, and they prepare us for the deeper questions that the remaining parts of our exploration will need to address. Consider the substance called Greek fire. The Byzantine Empire developed this incendiary weapon sometime in the 7th century and used it with devastating effect in naval warfare for several hundred years. It would burn on water. It could be projected through siphons. It clung to whatever it touched and could not be easily extinguished. The Byzantines guarded its formula so carefully that it was never written down in any surviving source, and when the empire weakened in the later medieval period, the formula was simply lost. Modern historians and chemists have proposed various reconstructions involving naphtha, quicklime, sulfur, saltpeter, and other ingredients in different proportions, but none of these reconstructions has produced anything quite matching the contemporary descriptions of Greek fire's behavior. The substance worked. Eyewitnesses across centuries described its effects in consistent terms. And then it stopped working because the people who knew how to make it died without passing the knowledge on to anyone we have records of, and the substance disappeared from European warfare as completely as if it had never existed. We know it was real because too many independent sources describe it in too much detail. We do not know what it was. The recipe is gone. This is not a mysterious gap in some legendary or magical sense. It is a perfectly ordinary historical loss. But it illustrates how a piece of practical knowledge of considerable strategic importance, held by a major civilization, could simply evaporate within a few generations once the institutional structures that maintained it broke down. Now multiply this kind of loss across all the categories of medieval practical knowledge that I described earlier in our exploration. The dyers, the metalworkers, the apothecaries, the masons, the navigators, the herbalists, the midwives, the wise women and cunning men of every rural district. Each of these traditions held bodies of knowledge that were partially documented at best. When the institutional frameworks that supported them weakened or collapsed, when the apprenticeship chains were broken by plague or war or economic disruption, when the last practitioner of a particular technique died without successor, the knowledge simply ceased to exist. Not in the dramatic sense of being suppressed or hidden, in the quieter and more permanent sense of being forgotten. And we, looking back from the present, see only the artifacts that the lost knowledge produced, with no clear way to reconstruct the processes that produced them. This is why certain medieval colors cannot be exactly reproduced. Why the crispness of certain medieval steel cannot be matched by modern smiths working without analytical equipment. Why the construction sequence of certain buildings cannot be fully reverse engineered from the buildings themselves. The objects survive. The minds that made them are gone, and they took with them the implicit understandings that any reconstruction would need. There is a particular category of medieval reference that I find especially haunting, and it concerns what we might call the casual mention of forgotten things. A chronicler will be writing about something else entirely, the politics of a regional dispute, or the construction of a church, or the genealogy of a noble family, and in the middle of his account, he will drop a phrase that assumes knowledge his modern reader does not have. He will mention, for instance, that a certain procession went past the old stone, which everyone knows. He will not say which old stone, or where it was, or why it mattered. Everyone knew, in his time, in his region. He had no reason to specify. We, 800 years later, have no idea what he was referring to. The old stone might have been a Roman milestone, a Bronze Age standing stone, a boundary marker from some forgotten jurisdiction, a meeting place for some local custom that the chronicler assumed all his readers would recognize. The information he embedded in that single phrase, the specific local memory that gave the phrase its meaning, has been entirely lost. And if you read medieval chronicles attentively, with an eye for these moments of casual, unexplained reference, you find them everywhere. The annual gathering at such and such a place, the customary payment of such and such a thing, the rite of such and such an occasion. None of it explained, because none of it needed to be explained at the time. All of it now opaque to us, because the matrix of shared local knowledge that gave these phrases meaning has dissolved. This is a gentler kind of loss than the disappearance of Greek fire, but it is more pervasive, and it has consequences for how we should read the medieval period as a whole. When we encounter a strange custom, or a peculiar phrase, or an unexplained practice in the medieval record, we have a tendency to treat it as either explicable, in which case we offer some interpretation that fits our existing frameworks, or as mysterious, in which case we treat it as evidence of something hidden or forbidden. Both of these responses miss the most likely truth, which is that the practice was perfectly ordinary in its time, fully understood by its participants, embedded in a specific local context that gave it obvious meaning, and that this context has simply been lost. The medieval period is full of things that were not secrets to anyone alive at the time, but that have become secrets now because the people who knew them have all died and left no explanation behind. The mystery is not in the medieval mind. The mystery is in our distance from it. This realization should change how we approach some of the topics we have been examining throughout this exploration. The recurring symbols on cathedral stones, for instance. We have been treating these as a kind of code, as fragments of a lost teaching that we might in principle reconstruct if we had the right key. But it is at least equally possible that the symbols were not encoded knowledge at all, but rather the visible surface of a perfectly ordinary craft tradition, whose internal logic was so completely shared among practitioners that nobody felt any need to write it down. The symbols may have meant something, in the sense that they communicated specific information to those who knew the tradition, but the meaning may have been mundane rather than esoteric. They may have indicated the lodge a mason belonged to, or the stage of his career, or the project he had previously worked on, or the master under whom he had trained. The mundanity of the original meaning would not make the loss of that meaning any less complete. The symbols would still be unreadable to us, but the unreadability would be a function of historical distance rather than of any deliberate concealment, and the appropriate response would be a kind of patient agnosticism about what they communicated rather than confident speculation about secret traditions. The same applies to the forest customs, the protected trees and springs we discussed in an earlier part of this exploration. We have been holding open the possibility that these customs preserved some kind of perceptual access to the natural world that modern people have lost, that the medieval respect for certain places was tracking something real about the environment that we can no longer detect. This remains possible, but it is also possible, and probably more likely, that the customs encoded perfectly ordinary practical knowledge whose original justification has been forgotten while the practical results remain valid. The hawthorn that nobody cuts may have been preserved originally because it served as a reliable boundary marker, or because its location indicated the presence of a spring useful to travelers, or because the local soil there was unsuitable for cultivation, and the tree provided shade for animals on a particular path. The original reasons may have been lost while the custom of leaving the tree alone persisted, eventually accumulating the supernatural justifications that we encounter in later folklore. The folklore is real. The respect for the place is real. But the deepest layer, the original reason that someone first decided this tree should not be cut, may simply have been a piece of practical land management whose context has dissolved. This more sober interpretation is, I want to emphasize, not a debunking of the strangeness of the medieval period. It is, if anything, a deepening of it. Because the recognition that we have lost so much specific local knowledge, that the medieval landscape was layered with meaning that we can no longer access, that the practices we observe are the residue of frameworks that have entirely dissolved, is itself a profound and slightly disorienting realization. We are not looking at a clear period of history through a clean window. We are looking at the fragmentary surface of a vast lost civilization whose internal logic has been mostly forgotten, and whose strangeness is largely a function of our inability to see the context that originally made it sensible. The medieval period is not stranger than ours, because medieval people had access to mysterious knowledge we lack. It is stranger than ours, because medieval people had access to ordinary knowledge we lack, the local, particular, embodied, situational knowledge that came from living in a specific place for generations and that cannot be reconstructed from any archive. And yet, within this larger field of ordinary loss, there are specific cases that resist the deflationary explanation, that do not seem to fit even the most generous interpretation of forgotten local context. There are categories of medieval phenomenon where the deflationary reading falls short, where the surviving evidence points to something that does not reduce neatly to lost practical knowledge or dissolved local meaning. I want to begin pointing toward these cases now, because they will form the spine of the remaining parts of our exploration, and I want you to understand the careful path we are walking. We have been deflating the easy mysteries, the ones that are best explained by ordinary historical loss and the asymmetry between practical and documentary knowledge. We have been holding open the hard cases, the ones where the deflationary reading does not quite work. As we move into the deeper sections of this exploration, we are going to look more carefully at those hard cases, and we are going to ask what kind of conclusions, if any, are honestly available to us. The category I want to introduce now, as a bridge into the next part, is the category of medieval testimony that does not fit the standard frameworks, even when we are most generous to medieval observers. Reports that come to us from multiple independent sources, in different regions, in different centuries, describing experiences or events whose consistency is harder to explain than ordinary cultural transmission would predict. Reports embedded in legal documents and medical texts and private correspondence, places where the writer had no obvious incentive to fabricate or embellish. Reports that medieval skeptics within the period itself examined and found difficult to dismiss. The orthodox response to these reports has been to apply the same explanatory frameworks we have been using throughout this exploration: ergot poisoning, mass psychogenic illness, religious enthusiasm, cultural inheritance, and to extend these frameworks until they cover the cases. The harder question is whether the frameworks always extend cleanly, or whether at the edges of the medieval evidence there are reports that genuinely strain our explanatory resources. Picture, before we move on, a small parish church in a village somewhere in the Rhineland in the year 1340. A priest is writing in the margin of a missal, in a hand that is clearly not the original copyist's. He is recording something that happened in his parish the previous winter, which he wants to remember but does not want to put in the official parish record. The thing he is recording is brief, 2 lines of cramped Latin, and it concerns a procession that was seen one night by several sober and credible witnesses passing along the old road on the eve of a feast day. The procession was, in his telling, of a kind that the church does not officially recognize, but that the older people in the village still describe as not entirely uncommon at certain times of year. The priest does not interpret what he saw, or rather what his parishioners saw. He simply records that it was seen, by whom, on what date, and lets the matter rest there. 800 years later, the missal will be catalogued by a librarian who notices the marginal note and transcribes it. Historians will read the transcription. Some will dismiss it as a folkloric intrusion into an otherwise reliable document. Some will treat it as evidence of the persistence of pre-Christian belief. A few, working carefully, will note that it is one of dozens of similar marginal notes from across medieval Europe, distributed in a pattern that does not quite match what either dismissal or simple folkloric explanation would predict. These few will hold the notes in their minds, gently, and ask whether the cumulative weight of such testimony amounts to anything we are capable of recognizing. 2113. Claude responded, "It is into the cumulative weight of that testimony that I want to take you now, because the marginal note in the Rhineland Missal is not an isolated case. It is into the cumulative weight of that testimony that I want to take you now, because the marginal note in the Rhineland Missal is not an isolated case. It is one example of a category of medieval evidence that, when assembled across the surviving record, forms a pattern more coherent than any of its individual instances. The category I have in mind is the category of medieval procession sightings, and it is worth sitting with for a long, careful moment, because it is one of those places where the standard explanatory frameworks begin to feel slightly inadequate, even when applied generously. The basic phenomenon is this. From at least the 11th century onward, there are reports across the breadth of medieval Europe of nocturnal processions seen by ordinary witnesses, often along old roads, often on specific nights of the year, often with characteristics that do not match any officially sanctioned ecclesiastical procession or any documented secular event. The witnesses describe groups of figures moving in formation, sometimes mounted, sometimes on foot, sometimes accompanied by sounds of music or hunting horns or the rattle of harness, sometimes silent in a way that the witnesses themselves found unnatural. The processions appear and disappear in ways that cannot easily be reconciled with normal human movement. They are seen at distances that should make identification difficult, and yet the witnesses are often able to describe specific details of dress and equipment with confidence. They cluster around certain dates, particularly the eves of major liturgical feasts, the solstices and equinoxes, and certain local anniversaries that the witnesses themselves often cannot fully explain. And they appear, with regional variations of name and detail, in sources from Scandinavia to Iberia, from Ireland to the Carpathians, in legal records and ecclesiastical complaints and chronicle entries and private correspondence across a span of centuries. The mainstream explanations for this phenomenon are several, and they are not foolish. The first is that the witnesses were seeing real human groups whose nature was misidentified, perhaps poachers moving at night, perhaps military patrols, perhaps groups of pilgrims or peasants engaged in unauthorized religious processions of the kind the church repeatedly tried to suppress. The second is that the witnesses were experiencing a particular form of cultural projection in which ambient sounds and shadows and the natural movements of wildlife were interpreted through the framework of an existing folkloric expectation. The third is that the reports represent embellishments and elaborations of older mythological material, the legend of the Wild Hunt being the most famous example, which Christian observers gradually transformed into accounts of seen rather than imagined processions. Each of these explanations covers part of the territory. None of them, I would argue, covers all of it. And the residue, the proportion of the reports that resists each of these readings, is what makes the phenomenon worth examining carefully tonight. Take the question of misidentified human activity. This explanation works for a portion of the cases, particularly those reported from regions and periods where unauthorized nocturnal gatherings were common. But it struggles with the consistency of the descriptions across regions where the supposed underlying activity would have been quite different. The poacher in Yorkshire and the pilgrim in Provence and the peasant in Pomerania were doing different things, in different terrains, with different equipment, and yet the descriptions of what witnesses thought they saw share specific structural features that the underlying activities do not. The procession is in formation. The figures are unusually tall or unusually small, or move in ways that human walking does not produce. There is often an accompanying sense of cold, or of unseasonable wind, or of an alteration in the quality of light that the witnesses found memorable. The misidentification explanation requires us to believe that across all these different regional contexts, the witnesses were misidentifying different things in the same way, which strains the explanation to a degree that historians sometimes acknowledge and sometimes politely overlook. The cultural projection explanation is more flexible, and it accounts for more of the data. Medieval Europeans did inhabit a perceptual world, saturated with the expectation of nocturnal supernatural activity, and the brain is famously prone to interpreting ambiguous sensory input in terms of the categories it expects to encounter. If you grow up hearing stories of the Wild Hunt, the rustle of branches and the flicker of moonlight on a distant hillside may, on the right night, organize themselves in your mind into the procession your culture has prepared you to see. This is a real phenomenon, well documented in modern psychological research, and it certainly accounts for many of the medieval reports. But it has a limitation that becomes visible when you examine the reports in detail. The cultural projection model predicts that witnesses will see what their culture has prepared them to see, with the particular details varying according to local tradition. What we actually find in the medieval reports is that the broad structure of the experience is consistent across regions with quite different folkloric traditions, while the specific cultural overlays vary in ways that suggest they were applied to a common underlying experience rather than being the source of the experience itself. The Wild Hunt of Germanic tradition, the Mene Delequin of northern France, the Slua Cedar of Ireland, the various Mediterranean processions of the dead, share a common skeletal structure that the differing cultural narratives clothe rather than constitute. This pattern is more consistent with a shared underlying perceptual or cognitive phenomenon, being interpreted through different cultural lenses than with the cultural lenses themselves generating the experience from nothing. The mythological elaboration explanation has a similar problem. There is no question that the wild hunt motif and its analogues drew on older mythological material, and that medieval Christian writers shaped their descriptions according to existing literary traditions. But the reports we are examining are not, in many cases, drawn from literary or mythological sources. They appear in legal depositions, in ecclesiastical disciplinary records, in private letters, in marginal notes like the one I described earlier, in places where the writers were not engaged in the elaboration of mythology, but in the recording of testimony. The witness in a legal proceeding had no incentive to fabricate a wild hunt sighting, and considerable disincentive given the church's general suspicion of such reports. The priest writing a private marginal note had no audience he was trying to impress. The chronicler, dropping a casual reference to a procession seen on a particular night, was treating the report as an event rather than as a literary set piece. The mythological framework was certainly available to these witnesses and recorders, and it shaped how they articulated their experiences. But the mythological framework alone does not seem to be what was generating the experiences in the first place. So we are left with a residue of evidence that resists each of the standard explanations when applied in isolation, and that resists them even in combination, though combinations do better than any single explanation. What do we do with such a residue? The honest answer is that we do not know what to do with it, and the various proposals that have been offered all run into difficulties. The maximalist alternative reading, that the witnesses were seeing some kind of real, non-ordinary phenomenon, requires metaphysical commitments that go beyond what the evidence can support. The minimalist mainstream reading, that everything reduces to misidentification and projection and elaboration in some combination, requires us to ignore the residue or to extend the standard explanations beyond their natural reach. The middle position, which I find most defensible, is to acknowledge that we have a body of testimony whose internal consistency is interesting, whose explanatory reduction is incomplete, and whose ultimate nature we cannot determine from the surviving evidence alone. The procession sightings are one of those medieval puzzles where the appropriate response is sustained attention rather than confident conclusion, and where the discipline of holding a question open without rushing to answer it is itself a kind of intellectual virtue. I want to bring in here a related and somewhat more concrete category of evidence, because it bears on the same general question and may help us see the shape of what we are dealing with more clearly. The category is the medieval ghost report, and it differs from the procession sighting in several useful ways. Medieval ghost reports are often more specific in their details than procession sightings. They typically involve a single recognizable figure rather than an anonymous group, often a recently deceased person known to the witness. They are frequently embedded in legal or financial contexts, because medieval ghost reports often concern unfinished business of some kind, debts unpaid, or wills disputed, or property unjustly held. And they were taken seriously by medieval institutions in ways that strain the modern dismissive reading. The Church, in particular, developed elaborate procedures for evaluating ghost reports, distinguishing legitimate visitations of souls from purgatory, from demonic deceptions imitating the dead. And these procedures were applied with a care that suggests the institution treated the underlying phenomena as real, even when it disputed their interpretation. Consider the famous 12 ghost stories of Byland Abbey, recorded in the early 15th century by an anonymous monk in the margins of an older theological manuscript. These stories are not literary productions in the elaborate style of, say, the contemporary romances. They are short, factual seeming accounts of specific encounters between specific named individuals and specific identifiable revenants, often with practical rather than theological resolutions. A man meets the ghost of a former neighbor on a road. The ghost requests that certain debts be settled and that masses be said for his soul. The living man arranges these things. The ghost appears no more. The accounts are matter-of-fact in tone. They assume their readers will find the events plausible, and they treat the encounters as a normal, if unsettling, part of regional life. The monk who recorded them was clearly familiar with the broader medieval theological literature on ghosts, and he applies its categories to his accounts. But the accounts themselves have the texture of testimony rather than literary invention. They feel like things that the monk had actually heard from people he had reason to trust. The standard interpretation of these accounts is that they reflect medieval beliefs about purgatory and the relationship between the living and the recently dead, and that the specific encounters described are either pious fictions designed to reinforce these beliefs or sincere reports of experiences that we would now classify as bereavement hallucinations, the relatively common experience of recently bereaved people perceiving the presence of their deceased loved ones. Both of these explanations are plausible, and both probably account for a portion of the medieval ghost literature. But once again, we run into the problem of residue. The accounts in the Byland manuscript and similar collections include cases that do not fit either explanation cleanly. There are reports of ghosts appearing to multiple witnesses simultaneously, where the bereavement hallucination model breaks down. There are reports of ghosts identifying themselves to witnesses who did not know them in life and whose subsequent investigations confirmed the ghost's claims about identity and circumstance. There are reports of ghosts providing information that the witnesses could not have known and that turned out to be accurate, including the location of hidden documents or the specific terms of disputed agreements. The pious fiction explanation requires us to dismiss the practical contexts in which these accounts were embedded. The bereavement hallucination explanation requires us to ignore the multiple witness and verified information cases. Neither explanation accounts for the full range of the testimony. What I want to emphasize, again, is not that the medieval ghost reports prove anything supernatural. They do not, and any honest reading of the evidence has to acknowledge that the alternative explanations cover most of the cases most of the time. What the reports do is reveal the limits of our explanatory frameworks, the places where the residue exceeds what we can comfortably account for. This is the same pattern we encountered with the procession sightings, with the cathedral construction techniques, with the Portolan charts, with the recurring symbols on stones. In each case, the standard explanations cover the bulk of the evidence, and a smaller portion of the evidence resists clean reduction. Across all these cases, the residues are in the same direction. They suggest that medieval Europe contained dimensions of experience and capability and knowledge that we have not yet fully accounted for, and that the official picture of the period systematically underestimates the strangeness and complexity of what was actually happening. In the next stretch of our exploration, I want to turn from these scattered residues to a more focused examination of certain specific medieval institutions whose internal workings we have only fragmentary access to, and which may help us understand how some of this strangeness was preserved and transmitted across the centuries. Because the procession sightings and the ghost reports and the recurring symbols and the unexplained construction techniques did not exist in a vacuum. They existed in a society with specific organizational structures, some visible to us and some only partially visible. And the visible parts of those structures may give us clues about the parts that have remained hidden. Picture, as we move toward that examination, a reading room in a monastic library in the year 1380. A monk is reading a manuscript that was written 200 years before, in a hand he can decipher only with effort. The manuscript contains, in addition to its main text, a set of marginal notes that were added later by readers whose identities he cannot determine. The notes are in different hands, in different inks, and they comment on the main text in ways that suggest a long conversation among readers who shared something the monk himself does not quite share. He cannot tell what they shared, or how they came to share it, or whether the conversation is still continuing somewhere outside the walls of his library. He copies the manuscript faithfully, marginal notes included, and adds his own small mark to the corner of the last page. The mark is one he was taught by his master, who was taught by his master, going back as far as anyone in the abbey can remember. The mark in the corner of that manuscript is the kind of small, easily overlooked detail that opens onto one of the most quietly fascinating dimensions of the mark in the corner of that manuscript is the kind of small, easily overlooked detail that opens onto one of the most quietly fascinating dimensions of the medieval period. Because medieval Europe was, beneath its highly visible institutional surface of crowns and bishoprics and universities and guilds, a society organized through a dense network of smaller and less visible associations, each with its own internal customs, its own forms of recognition, its own bodies of shared knowledge, and its own ways of preserving continuity across generations. Some of these smaller associations are well documented. Most are documented only in fragments. A few are documented essentially not at all, and we know they existed only because their effects are visible in the historical record, even when the associations themselves are not. The most familiar of these associations are the guilds, and the guilds are a useful starting point because they are documented well enough that we can see the general shape of how such bodies operated, and we can then extrapolate carefully to the less documented cases. A medieval craft guild was not simply a trade association in the modern sense. It was something more like a complete social institution embedded in the religious and civic and economic life of its town, with responsibilities and prerogatives that extended far beyond the regulation of a particular craft. The guild oversaw the training of apprentices and the certification of masters. It maintained quality standards for the goods its members produced. It controlled access to the trade and protected its members from outside competition. But it also maintained a chapel, often dedicated to a patron saint, whose protection the guild claimed in particular. It supported widows and orphans of deceased members. It organized funerals and memorial masses. It participated in civic processions on specific feast days, marching under its own banner with its own regalia. It had its own meeting hall, often quite elaborate, where the inner business of the guild was conducted in private. And it had its own initiation ceremonies, in which apprentices became journeymen and journeymen became masters, ceremonies that involved oaths and tokens and recognitions whose specific content the guild did not share with outsiders. Most of what happened in guild halls was perfectly mundane. Accounts were reviewed, disputes between members were adjudicated, new regulations were proposed and voted on. The day-to-day life of a guild was the day-to-day life of any organized human institution, with all the ordinary tedium and minor politicking that such institutions involve. But within this mundane surface, there was, in every guild, a layer of internal practice that the members did not discuss with non-members. The specific words spoken at the moment of admission to mastery. The specific gestures by which guild members recognized each other in unfamiliar towns. The specific marks they placed on their work. The specific keys they used to interpret the marks of others. The specific ways they communicated information to fellow members through means that outsiders would not recognize as communication at all. This layer was not necessarily mystical or esoteric. It was, more often than not, a perfectly practical system for verifying that someone claiming to be a member of a particular trade really was one. that the goods someone was selling really had been produced by a qualified craftsman, that the journeyman appearing at a workshop door looking for employment really had completed his training, rather than merely claiming to have done so. In a society without standardized credentials, without photographic identification, without centralized record keeping that any traveler could access, the only way to verify someone's professional identity was through the kind of internal recognition system that the guilds developed. And these recognition systems, once developed, naturally accumulated additional layers over time, layers that combined practical verification with social bonding, with religious observance, with the simple human pleasure of belonging to an inner circle whose practices were one's own. Now here is where the picture becomes interesting. The guilds we have just described are the visible craft guilds of the medieval town. But medieval Europe contained, in addition to these, a wide variety of other associations that were structured in similar ways, but that operated outside the formal craft framework. There were religious confraternities, lay associations dedicated to specific devotional practices, often centered on a particular saint or a particular form of charitable work, with their own internal customs and recognition signs. There were merchant guilds, which overlapped with but were distinct from craft guilds, and which operated across longer distances and through more elaborate networks of mutual recognition. There were fraternal associations attached to particular military or religious orders, including the famous case of the Knights Templar, whose internal practices became the subject of intense controversy at their suppression, and whose recognition signs and ceremonies have been the subject of speculation ever since. There were students' associations and faculty associations within the universities, with their own customs and rivalries and traditions of mutual recognition. There were associations of pilgrims who had completed particular journeys, including the Compostela pilgrims, who wore the scallop shell and who recognized each other on the roads. There were associations of penitents and flagellants and various other devotional movements that the Church alternately tolerated and persecuted. And there were associations whose nature and purpose we cannot now determine, because they appear in the historical record only as scattered references, mentioned in passing by people who assumed their readers would know what they meant. The phenomenon I want to draw your attention to is not the existence of any one of these associations. It is the cumulative weight of having so many of them, all overlapping, all operating within the same population, all producing their own internal cultures and practices and recognition systems. A single medieval craftsman might be simultaneously a member of his craft guild, a member of his parish confraternity, a former pilgrim with the lifelong recognition rights that pilgrimage conferred, a participant in a particular devotional practice with its own associated customs, and a holder of one or more inherited family practices whose origins his own family no longer remembered clearly. Each of these affiliations connected him to a network of other people who shared specific practices with him, who could recognize him by specific signs, who would offer him specific kinds of assistance and expect specific kinds of cooperation in return. The medieval social fabric was woven from dozens of such overlapping networks, and the resulting texture of social life was vastly more complex than the simple hierarchical model of king and nobles and clergy and peasants that we sometimes inherit. This matters for our exploration tonight because it provides the social mechanism by which all the strange phenomena we have been discussing could have been preserved and transmitted across centuries without leaving the kind of clear documentary trail that historians normally rely on. The recurring symbols on cathedral stones do not require a single secret organization with continuous existence over multiple centuries. They require only a craft tradition with the normal internal cultural practices of any medieval guild, transmitting its working vocabulary through ordinary apprenticeship channels, with the symbols carrying ordinary practical meaning that simply happen to be preserved within the trade rather than written down for outsiders. The persistent forest customs do not require a hidden survival of pre-Christian religion. They require only the normal local cultural practices of village communities, transmitted through ordinary families and ordinary neighbors, with the original justifications gradually dissolving while the practices persisted because they continued to seem useful or proper or simply customary. The Portolan charts do not require some lost civilization's geographic knowledge. They require only the normal internal information networks of merchant and sailor communities, accumulating practical observations across generations of voyages and incorporating them into working documents that the wider literate culture had no access to. In each case, the explanatory mechanism is the same. Medieval Europe contained a vast informal substrate of association-based knowledge transmission, and this substrate was largely invisible to the institutions that produced our archives. And what looks mysterious from our position is often simply the visible surface of activity within that invisible substrate. We see the symbols on the stones. We do not see the conversations in the lodge halls where the symbols' meanings were taught. We see the customs at the tree. We do not see the family kitchens where the customs were transmitted from grandmother to granddaughter. We see the unusual coastline detail on the chart. We do not see the night in the harbour tavern where one sailor told another about a coast he had seen on a voyage that nobody bothered to record. But once we accept this general picture, we have to ask a harder question. If so much medieval knowledge was preserved through informal association-based networks, what happened to those networks? Most of them are gone. The medieval craft guilds were progressively weakened by economic and political changes from the late medieval period onward, and most were definitively dissolved during the 18th and 19th centuries. The religious confraternities were largely suppressed during the Reformation in Protestant areas and gradually transformed beyond recognition in Catholic ones. The pilgrimage traditions were disrupted by the religious controversies of the early modern period and by the changing patterns of travel and communication that came with the modern transportation revolution. The village-level networks of local custom and practice were dissolved by enclosure, by industrialization, by the depopulation of the countryside, by the gradual replacement of inherited local knowledge with standardized formal education. The substrate that preserved medieval knowledge for centuries did not survive into the modern period. It was systematically eroded, and most of what it carried was lost in the erosion. Some of what was carried did survive, however, and the surviving fragments give us our best access to what the substrate originally contained. Some traditions persisted in fossilized forms within the institutions that succeeded their original carriers. The Freemasons, whatever the historical accuracy of their claimed continuity with the medieval operative Masons guilds, preserved at least some elements of those guilds' internal culture and recognition practices, and the modern fraternal orders that derive from or imitate Freemasonry preserve further attenuated versions of the same patterns. Some traditions persisted in the rural folklore that 19th century antiquarians began collecting, often after the original practical context had been forgotten and only the residue of custom remained. Some traditions persisted in the technical vocabularies of trades that maintained continuity into the modern period, including the language of stonemasonry and shipbuilding and certain forms of metalwork. And some traditions left their traces only in the strange residues we have been examining throughout this exploration. The symbols and customs and recurring patterns whose meanings we can no longer fully reconstruct because the networks that carried those meanings have all dissolved. What I want you to hold in your mind as we move toward the deeper questions that lie ahead is the realization that the medieval period we are trying to understand was held together by a kind of social tissue that no longer exists. The kingdoms and bishoprics and universities and guilds that left us their archives were the visible skeleton of medieval society, but the flesh of that society, the dense connective tissue of associations and confraternities and informal networks, has largely decomposed. What we encounter in the medieval archive is the bone structure of a body whose soft parts are mostly gone, and the strange shapes we sometimes see in the bones are evidence of the soft parts that were attached to them. The strangeness is not necessarily in the bones themselves. The strangeness is in the absent flesh, and the bones bear marks of attachments we can only imagine. This realization should make us humble, but it should not make us defeated, because the bones do bear marks, and the marks can be read, however imperfectly. The buildings still stand, the artifacts still exist, the texts still survive, with their casual references and their unexplained allusions and their marginal notes added by readers we cannot identify. The folklore was partially collected before it entirely disappeared, and the collections, with all their distortions, still preserve real fragments of what was actually believed and practiced. The work of patient historical reconstruction continues, and every decade adds new material to our understanding, often by recognizing connections between fragments that previous generations had treated as unrelated. We will never recover the full medieval picture, but we can continue to see more of it than we currently do, and the seeing will continue to surprise us. Picture, as we move into the next stretch of our exploration, a small inn on a country road in the year 1450. It is late in the evening, and a group of travelers are sitting around a fire after their meal. They are strangers to each other, brought together only by the accident of needing shelter on the same night. As they talk, certain phrases pass between them, certain references, certain small gestures that some of those present recognize and others do not. A merchant from Antwerp and a journeyman mason from Mainz discover they share a connection through the fraternity of a particular shrine. A widow traveling to her sister's wedding and an elderly priest discover they have both completed the pilgrimage to a particular site and exchange the customary greetings of returned pilgrims. A young scholar bound for Bologna and an old soldier returning from the Hungarian frontier find that they have a friend in common, the friend being a third party they have each met separately, but whose name they recognize when it is mentioned. The conversation moves easily, finding the connections that the participants had not known existed when they first sat down together. By the time the fire burns low and the travelers seek their beds, they have established a small temporary network of mutual recognition that will dissolve in the morning when they go their separate ways. This kind of evening was happening on any given night in thousands of inns across medieval Europe. The connections established were ephemeral but real, and they were one of the ways in which the great invisible substrate of medieval association continued to renew itself across the generations. The travelers in that inn would have parted in the morning carrying with them, in addition to whatever they had eaten and whatever business they were engaged in, certain things that had passed between them in the conversation around the fire. Names of people to look up in the towns they were heading to. Recommendations of inns that could be trusted and inns that could not. Reports of road conditions and political developments and outbreaks of disease in regions they would shortly be entering. And, in some cases, fragments of stranger information, the kind that medieval people exchanged carefully, looking around first to see who was listening, the kind of information that did not appear in any official record, but that mattered to the people who needed to know it. Tonight, I want to follow the trail of one of those stranger categories of information, because it leads us into a dimension of medieval life that has been particularly thoroughly buried by subsequent centuries of editing and rewriting. I want to talk about medieval medicine, and specifically about the kinds of medicine that did not happen in universities or in the courts of princes, or in the formal pharmacopoeias of the major apothecary guilds. I want to talk about the medicine of the cunning men and the wise women, of the village healers and the local midwives, of the people who handled the bodies of their neighbors when those neighbors were sick or giving birth or dying, and who held in their hands a body of practical knowledge that ran parallel to to the official medical traditions of the period, and that was, in certain specific ways, more sophisticated than the official traditions were. The official medical tradition of medieval Europe was, by the high medieval period, a fairly coherent intellectual system, derived primarily from the Greek physician Galen, as transmitted through Arabic translations and commentaries, and reintegrated into Latin Europe through the medical schools of Salerno and Montpellier and Bologna. This tradition understood the body in terms of the four humours, blood and phlegm, and yellow bile and black bile, whose proper balance constituted health, and whose imbalance constituted disease. Treatment proceeded through dietary regulation, through the manipulation of environmental factors like heat and cold and dryness and moisture, through the administration of substances chosen for their humoral qualities, and through the various procedures of bleeding and purging and cupping that aimed to restore humoral balance directly. This system had its own internal logic, and it produced practitioners who were genuinely learned in the literature of their tradition, who could discuss diseases and treatments in elaborate theoretical detail, and who carried significant social authority in the communities they served. It also produced, by modern standards, fairly limited therapeutic results. The university-trained physician of the medieval period was an erudite figure whose actual ability to cure most diseases was no better, and was sometimes considerably worse than the average outcome of doing nothing. Medieval people knew this. They were not naive about the limits of formal medicine, and they responded to those limits in ways that the historical record only partially preserves. What they responded with, in most cases, was a parallel tradition of practical healing that was not based on humoral theory at all, but on accumulated empirical observation of what actually worked, transmitted through informal networks of practitioners who often could not read, but who had access to centuries of practical experimentation that the formal medical tradition had largely ignored. The cunning man or wise woman of a typical medieval village did not have a Galenic education, but she had something the university-trained physician often did not have, which was a working acquaintance with the actual properties of the local plants, the actual symptoms of the actual diseases that her actual neighbours actually suffered from, and the practical experience of what kinds of intervention tended to produce what kinds of outcome. She knew, for instance, that the bark of a particular willow could ease fever and pain, centuries before anyone isolated the salicylates that explain why this is true. She knew that a particular mold growing on damp bread, applied to a wound, could prevent the wound from putrefying, centuries before anyone identified the antibacterial compounds responsible. She knew which kinds of headache responded to feverfew, and which kinds responded to willow, and which kinds responded to a darkened room and silence. She knew that a woman with persistent unexplained bleeding should be given iron-rich foods, though she would have explained this in entirely different terms than a modern physician would. She knew dozens of techniques for managing childbirth that the male physicians of the universities would not encounter even theoretically because they did not attend births, which were considered the proper domain of women and were managed entirely by midwives, whose knowledge was transmitted from one woman to the next without ever entering the formal medical literature. This parallel tradition has been seriously underestimated by the historiography of medieval medicine, partly because its practitioners did not write, partly because the formal medical tradition that did write tended to dismiss or ignore it, and partly because the early modern period's witch hunts subsequently destroyed both many of its practitioners and much of the cultural infrastructure that had sustained it. The witch trials of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries are usually understood, correctly, as a complex phenomenon involving religious anxiety and political opportunism and various forms of social pathology. What is less often emphasized is that the people accused were disproportionately the cunning men and wise women of their communities, the local healers whose practical knowledge made them both useful and threatening. and that the witch hunts effectively decimated the practitioner networks that had carried this knowledge across the medieval centuries. By the time 18th and 19th century antiquarians began collecting folk medicine in Europe, they were collecting fragments of a tradition that had been catastrophically disrupted, and many of the fragments they recorded were already opaque to the people who remembered them, having lost the practical context in which they originally made sense. What survived in the fragments is interesting, however, because it preserves enough to allow us to see the general shape of what was lost. Modern pharmacological research has now confirmed the active medicinal properties of a substantial proportion of the plants that medieval folk healers used. The list is long enough to be striking. Foxglove, which the wise women of England used for what they called the dropsy, contains digitalis, which is still used for congestive heart failure. Meadowsweet, used for fevers and aches, contains salicin and was the original source of the compound that became aspirin. Yarrow, used for wound healing, contains compounds with genuine antimicrobial and clotting properties. St. John's wort, used for what medieval sources call melancholy, contains hypericin and other compounds with documented antidepressant effects. Garlic, used for any number of conditions, contains allicin with broad antimicrobial activity. The folk medicine of medieval Europe was not random. It was a body of empirically validated knowledge, accumulated through centuries of careful observation by practitioners who could not have explained why their treatments worked, but who knew with practical certainty that they did. The university-trained physicians of the period, working from humoral theory, often did less well by their patients than the village wise women working from inherited practical knowledge, and medieval people of all classes were quite aware of this. The wealthy who could afford university-trained physicians often consulted them for the social authority they conferred, while quietly relying on local healers for what actually worked. But within this large category of empirically grounded folk medicine, there sat a smaller category of practice that is harder to categorize, and it is to this smaller category that I want to draw your attention now. Medieval folk medicine was not purely empirical, in the sense of consisting only of techniques whose efficacy could be verified by ordinary observation. It also included a layer of practice that was structured around ideas about how illness propagated, how it could be transferred from one person to another, or from a person to an object, or from a place to a person, and how these transfers could be manipulated for therapeutic purposes. The practices in question were generally called, by historians who study them, sympathetic or transferential techniques, and they involve operations like passing a sick child through the cleft of a particular tree, or burying a vessel containing the patient's hair under a specific kind of stone, or rubbing a wart with a cut potato that is then buried so that the wart will rot away as the potato rots. Modern medicine classifies these techniques as superstitions, and most of them probably are. The transferential framework rests on assumptions about disease that are simply incorrect, and the techniques that follow from those assumptions usually do not produce real therapeutic results. Most of them, however, is not all of them. There is a residue, again, of medieval folk medical practice that does not reduce cleanly to either empirical pharmacology or pure superstition, and that is genuinely difficult to categorize. Consider the medieval treatment of certain skin conditions through the application of substances that modern analysis has shown to contain active compounds, but applied through ritualized procedures that include specific words and gestures. The active compound presumably did the actual therapeutic work, but the medieval practitioners did not separate the compound from the ritual, and they sometimes specified that the ritual elements were essential to the cure, that the substance alone would not work without the accompanying procedure. This is the kind of claim that modern scholarship typically dismisses as elaboration, the practitioner exaggerating the importance of the showy parts of the treatment to enhance her own authority. But the consistency with which such claims appear, across regions and centuries, raises the harder question of whether the practitioners might have been observing something real about the relationship between physical treatment and psychological context. Something that we now recognize partially through the placebo effect and the broader field of mind-body medicine, and that medieval practitioners may have been navigating practically through ritual frameworks they could not have explained in modern terms. The placebo effect is well documented in modern medical research, and it is not a small phenomenon. For a substantial range of conditions, particularly those involving pain, mood, and the various symptoms that have significant psychological components, ritualized treatment with inert substances produces real therapeutic effects, sometimes approaching the effects of pharmacologically active treatments. The mechanisms by which this works are partially understood and involve real physiological responses to expectation and meaning, mediated through the nervous and endocrine systems. Modern medicine generally treats the placebo effect as a confounding factor to be controlled for in clinical trials, rather than as a therapeutic resource to be deliberately deployed. Medieval folk medicine, lacking any framework that would distinguish placebo effects from pharmacological effects, simply treated everything that worked as a real treatment and combined ritual and substance freely without worrying about which component was producing which result. This pragmatic approach almost certainly made medieval folk practitioners more effective with certain conditions than they would have been if they had used either substance alone or ritual alone, and it almost certainly contributed to the practical reputation that the cunning men and wise women maintained even in the face of competition from the formally trained physicians. What I want you to take from this is not a romanticized view of medieval folk medicine, which contained plenty of genuine errors and harmful practices, alongside the genuine knowledge it preserved. What I want you to take is a more accurate sense of the actual epistemic situation in medieval Europe. There were two parallel medical traditions, one formally written and theoretically elaborate but practically limited, the other informally transmitted and theoretically inarticulate but practically more grounded. The two traditions interacted in complex ways, with the formal tradition borrowing selectively from the folk tradition while officially disdaining it, and with the folk tradition borrowing selectively from the formal tradition while remaining largely independent of its theoretical framework. Most medieval people, when they were sick, drew on both traditions according to their circumstances and their judgment of what was likely to help. The picture of medieval medicine as a primitive system of bleeding and humoral balance is correct only if we restrict our attention to the formally written tradition, which was a small fraction of what actually happened when medieval bodies needed care. This realization deepens the more general picture we have been building throughout our exploration. The asymmetry between what medieval people knew and what they wrote down was not just a curiosity of the period. It was a structural feature of medieval life, with consequences for nearly everything we try to understand about the era. The medical tradition we have been describing is one example. The architectural tradition we discussed earlier is another. The cartographic tradition is a third. The forest customs and folk beliefs and seasonal practices are a fourth. In each case, what we have access to is the surface that the formal literate culture chose to record, and what we are missing is the much larger body of practical knowledge that the actual practitioners held and used and transmitted without ever submitting it to the act of writing. Medieval Europe, seen through its archives, looks one way. Medieval Europe, considered with attention to what its archives systematically omitted, looks quite another way. And the second view is closer to what life actually was for most of the people who lived through the period. Picture, before we move on, a small cottage on a winter evening in the year 1390. An old woman is sitting by the fire with her granddaughter, who has come to visit and to learn. The granddaughter is 15 years old, and she has been chosen by the family to inherit the work that the old woman has done in this village for 60 years. The old woman is showing her granddaughter how to prepare a particular preparation from a particular plant, gathered at a particular time of year, dried in a particular way, and combined with 2 other ingredients in a particular proportion. As she works, she explains. The explanation includes details about the plant and its preparation that any modern herbalist would recognize as practical. It also includes details about the time of day at which the preparation should be administered, about the words to be spoken when it is given, about the way the patient should be positioned while taking it. The old woman does not separate these details into categories of more and less essential. She presents them as a single integrated practice, all parts of which she learned from her own grandmother and which she has used successfully for 6 decades. The granddaughter listens carefully and tries to remember everything, knowing that her grandmother will not live many more winters, and that this is one of perhaps a dozen evenings she will have to learn what she needs to know. Outside, the snow is falling on the village. Inside, a body of practical knowledge that has been transmitted across an unknown number of generations is being passed from one careful pair of hands to another, in a transmission that the historical record will never note, and that future centuries will never quite be able to reconstruct. The transmission in that cottage was happening, in some form, in every village in medieval Europe on every winter evening across the centuries we have been examining. And the cumulative weight of all those transmissions, taken together, gives us a sense of just how much the medieval period contained that we now cannot directly access. But there is one further dimension of that hidden depth that I want to explore tonight, because it is the one that historians have, in some ways, treated most carelessly. I want to talk about the medieval dead. Specifically, I want to talk about how medieval people handled their dead, what they believed about the relationship between the living and the dead, and what the archaeological record reveals about practices that the textual record either omits entirely or describes in carefully neutral language that conceals more than it reveals. Because once you start examining the actual physical evidence of medieval burial practice, you encounter a category of phenomena that does not fit comfortably into any of the standard frameworks we have inherited for thinking about medieval Christianity. And that points towards something genuinely strange about the medieval relationship with mortality. The official picture of medieval death is, by now, fairly familiar. People died, often young, often horribly, of conditions that modern medicine could have managed easily. Their bodies were prepared by family members, given last rites by the parish priest, if one could be reached in time, washed and wrapped, and laid out for the customary period of vigil. They were buried in consecrated ground, in the parish cemetery, or in the church itself if the family had sufficient status, with prayers and candles, and the ringing of bells. Masses were said for their souls afterward, particularly during the early period when their souls were understood to be undergoing purification before admission to heaven. Their families remembered them at All Souls' Day each November and at the anniversaries of their deaths. And over time, their memory faded into the general pool of ancestors, whose intercession could still be requested, but whose individual identities the living gradually forgot. This is the picture we have inherited. It is largely accurate. It describes what happened to most medieval dead, most of the time. But it does not describe what happened to all of them. And the cases it does not describe are interesting precisely because they are not rare exceptions. They appear, when archaeologists look for them, in numbers that suggest a substantial parallel tradition of mortuary practice running alongside the official Christian one, sometimes blending with it, sometimes operating in apparent contradiction to it, and almost always involving treatments of the dead that the surviving textual sources do not adequately explain. Across medieval Europe, in cemeteries that are otherwise unremarkably Christian in their layout and dating, archaeologists have for decades been documenting burials that involve what are now technically called deviant mortuary practices, and the deviations form recognizable patterns that suggest specific intentional treatments rather than random irregularities. The most striking of these patterns involves what archaeologists sometimes call revenant burials, though the term is contested, and not all the practitioners who document these cases use it. The basic phenomenon is the apparent treatment of certain bodies in ways that suggest the burial party was concerned to prevent the body from rising or returning. Bodies are sometimes buried face down, contrary to all standard Christian practice, which orients the dead supine and facing east in expectation of the resurrection. Bodies are sometimes weighted with stones placed on the chest or limbs, sometimes pinned in place with iron implements driven through specific parts of the corpse, sometimes buried with stones placed in or against the mouth in ways that appear to be deliberate and that have no parallel in standard Christian burial. Bodies are sometimes decapitated after death, and the head placed at the feet rather than at the neck, or placed between the legs, or in some cases, placed face down, even when the rest of the body is in normal position. Bodies are sometimes buried with their feet bound together or with their hands tied behind their back. And in a smaller but consistent number of cases, bodies show evidence of post-mortem manipulations whose purpose is harder to interpret, including the deliberate breaking of bones, the placement of objects in the mouth or throat, and treatments of the eyes that suggest concern with what the dead might be expected to see. These practices are not confined to any single region or period within the medieval era. They are documented from England to Eastern Europe, from the early medieval period through into the post-medieval centuries, in cemeteries belonging to communities that were unambiguously Christian by every other measure of their burial practice. The burials are not in special locations. They are mixed in with normal burials, sometimes immediately adjacent to them, in the same consecrated ground administered by the same parish authorities. The people buried this way are not a uniform demographic. They include men and women, young and old, individuals whose other grave goods or skeletal evidence suggests they were ordinary members of their communities, rather than outcasts or criminals. Whatever the reason for their unusual treatment, that reason was not their general social status, but something specific about their particular cases. The mainstream interpretation of these burials is that they reflect a popular concern, not officially endorsed by the church but widely tolerated by it, with the possibility that certain dead people might return to harm the living. The medieval revenant tradition is well documented in a number of texts, including the byland ghost stories I mentioned earlier, and the more elaborate 12th century English chronicles of William of Newburgh and Walter Map, both of whom describe specific cases of recent dead who were observed to leave their graves, walk among the living, and cause illness or death until their bodies were located and dealt with. The methods these texts describe for dealing with revenants, including exhumation, decapitation, burning of the heart, and various forms of physical restraint, correspond directly to the archaeological evidence we are now finding in cemeteries across Europe. So the practices were real. The texts that describe them were not literary fictions, but accounts of actual events, and the archaeological evidence confirms what the texts have been telling us for centuries. But notice what this means about medieval Christianity. The official theology of the period had no place for revenants. The dead, in Orthodox Christian doctrine, went to purgatory, or to heaven, or to hell, and in none of these states were they expected to return bodily to the world of the living. The appearance of ghosts was theoretically possible, particularly as an act of divine permission for specific purposes, but the bodily return of the dead was not part of the official framework. And yet medieval Christians, in numbers we cannot precisely quantify, but that were clearly substantial, believed that this kind of return was possible, took specific steps to prevent it, and were apparently supported in these steps by the parish authorities who allowed the unusual burials to take place in consecrated ground. The church did not officially endorse these practices, but it did not officially prohibit them either. in any way that prevented them from being widely carried out. The result is a layer of medieval Christian practice that operated underneath or alongside the official doctrines, addressing concerns that the official doctrines did not address, using methods that the official theology could not explain. This pattern of an unofficial layer of practice running parallel to the official theology and addressing concerns the theology ignored is one we have encountered repeatedly throughout this exploration. It appears in the architectural tradition, where masons used techniques their formal training did not include. It appears in the medical tradition, where folk practitioners drew on knowledge that the university physicians did not possess. It appears in the cartographic tradition, where sailors recorded information that the formal geographers did not acknowledge. And it appears in the mortuary tradition, where the actual handling of the dead reflected concerns that the official funeral liturgy did not address. In every case, what the formal institutions of medieval Europe documented in their archives is a fraction of what was actually happening, and the unrecorded majority operated according to a logic that we can reconstruct only partially and only with considerable interpretive effort. The mortuary case has a particular sharpness, however, because it raises a question that the other cases do not raise quite so directly. The architectural and medical and cartographic cases involve practical knowledge whose unrecorded character we can explain through the ordinary mechanisms of trade secrecy and apprenticeship transmission. The mortuary case involves something different. It involves a widespread, persistent, geographically distributed concern about the possibility of the dead returning, expressed through specific physical interventions on specific corpses, in numbers that suggest this was not a marginal preoccupation, but a real and recurring worry. And the question this raises is what exactly was generating the concern? Why did medieval communities believe, persistently and widely, that some of their dead might return? What experiences were they responding to? The standard answers fall into several categories. One is that the belief in revenants was a cultural inheritance from pre-Christian tradition, persisting in folk practice despite its incompatibility with Christian theology, in the same way that other pagan elements persisted across the medieval period. This is partially true and explains the general framework of the belief. But it does not explain why specific individuals were singled out for revenant treatment, while others were buried normally, which suggests that the practice was responsive to particular circumstances, rather than simply applied as a general precaution. A second answer is that the singling out reflected social anxieties, with certain individuals identified as likely revenants because of pre-existing tensions in their communities, including suspicion of witchcraft, or unpopular personal traits, or the circumstances of their deaths. This is also partially true, and probably explains a portion of the cases. A third answer is that the practice reflected actual observations of what we would now call decompositional phenomena, including the sounds and movements that bodies sometimes produce in early decomposition, which medieval observers without modern forensic training might reasonably have interpreted as signs of continued life or unrest. This is also partially true, and it is well established that several specific revenant signs in medieval texts correspond to documented post-mortem changes that would have been mysterious to medieval observers. But once again, we run into the problem of residue. The standard explanations cover most of the cases. They do not cover all of them. And the cases they do not cover include some of the most carefully documented examples, where the witnesses were credible and the circumstances were specific, and the treatments applied to the body were, in their particularity, hard to derive from any general framework. In some of these cases, the medieval observers reported events that they treated as ordinary rather than extraordinary, which suggests that whatever was happening was within the range of what they considered familiar, even if it does not fit within our range of the familiar. We are, once more, at the edge of our explanatory resources, looking at a residue that does not reduce cleanly, and acknowledging that the medieval period contained dimensions of experience we do not have firm grounds for either accepting or dismissing. I want to close this part by drawing attention to something that may seem unrelated, but that I think is connected at a deeper level. The medieval relationship with the dead was not characterized only by fear of return. It was also characterized by a kind of intimacy that modern people would find difficult to inhabit. Medieval people lived in close physical proximity to their dead, both during the brief vigil that preceded burial and through the long subsequent presence of the cemetery in the center of every village, and the bones in the church charnel houses, and the family memorials in the floors of the parish churches, where the living worshipped on top of the buried dead every Sunday. The boundary between the living community and the dead community was permeable in ways that modern arrangements have systematically closed off. Medieval prayers for the dead were conversational. Medieval visits to family graves were regular and unremarkable. Medieval bones were sometimes exhumed after the bodies had decomposed and moved to charnel houses where they were stored in visible arrangements that the living regularly encountered. The dead, in short, were not removed from medieval life. They were held within it, addressed within it, integrated into it, in ways that strike modern sensibilities as morbid, but that medieval sensibilities took as natural and even comforting. Within this larger pattern of intimate relationship between living and dead, the specific concerns about revenants make a different kind of sense. The medieval anxiety about the possibility of certain dead returning was not the modern horror movie fear of the dead as alien and other. It was a more specific concern, embedded within an ongoing relationship with the dead, about the proper completion of that relationship. A dead person who had been properly buried, properly mourned, properly remembered, and whose soul had been attended to with the customary prayers, was understood to be at rest, even if still present in some sense to the community. A dead person whose burial had been interrupted, whose mourning had been incomplete, whose business with the living had been unfinished, or who had died under specific kinds of circumstances that the community recognized as ill-omened, was understood to be at risk of an improper rest, and the protective measures applied to the body were attempts to ensure proper completion despite the irregular circumstances. This is a very different framework from anything in modern thought about death, and it is one we should resist the temptation to dismiss too quickly, because it produced practical responses to real concerns within its own internally coherent worldview. Picture, before we move toward the closing parts of our exploration, a small parish cemetery in the year 1280. It is an ordinary winter morning. The ground is hard, and the gravediggers have had to work for several hours to open the earth. A coffin is being lowered, and the parish priest is performing the standard service, the responses being given by a small group of mourners gathered in the cold. The grave being filled is one of dozens in the cemetery, and from the surface, when the work is finished, this grave will look like all the others, marked with a simple wooden cross that will weather and fall within a generation. But what is being placed in the grave, in addition to the body, is something specific. And what is being done to the body before the earth is closed over it is something that the surviving records will not describe, but that the people present understand and accept as the appropriate response to the particular circumstances of this particular death. 800 years from now, archaeologists will open this grave during a routine excavation and find evidence of treatments they will interpret carefully according to the categories of their discipline. They will record their findings in a report that will form part of a growing literature on medieval deviant burial. And the literature will be, however careful and thorough, only a partial reconstruction of what the people standing around the grave on this winter morning understood themselves to be doing. The people standing around that winter grave understood themselves to be participating in something that connected them to a long sequence of similar moments. The people standing around that winter grave understood themselves to be participating in something that connected them to a long sequence of similar moments stretching back through the generations behind them, and they expected, with reasonable confidence, that similar moments would continue forward through the generations ahead. The continuity they took for granted was real. The medieval period had, by 1280, been operating within recognizable cultural patterns for centuries, and the people who lived through it had no particular reason to expect that those patterns would not continue indefinitely. The patterns did not continue, of course, and the question of why they did not, of what happened to medieval Europe between roughly 1300 and 1700, that brought its civilization to a kind of internal closure and replaced it with something fundamentally different, is the question I want to address tonight. Because the ending of the medieval period is itself one of the strangest puzzles of European history, and the standard explanations for it, while not wrong, are notably incomplete. The end of the medieval period is conventionally dated to a cluster of events between the late 14th and the late 15th centuries. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351, which killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of the European population. The Western Schism within the Church, which ran from 1378 to 1417 and damaged the institutional authority of Rome in ways from which it never fully recovered. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453, which closed the Eastern Mediterranean to Christian shipping and pushed European commerce decisively toward the Atlantic. The voyages of exploration in the late 15th century, which expanded the European geographic horizon in ways that the medieval cosmology could not absorb. The invention of the printing press around 1450, which transformed the economics of textual production and broke the institutional control of literacy that the church and the universities had previously held. And, looming over all of these, the Reformation of the early 16th century, which destroyed the religious unity of Latin Christendom and replaced it with a fragmented landscape of competing confessions whose disputes would dominate European politics for the next 200 years. Each of these events is real, and each contributed to the dissolution of the medieval synthesis. The standard narrative is that they cumulatively produced a civilizational transition, with the early modern period emerging from the wreckage of the medieval one in something resembling a continuous evolutionary process. This narrative is correct in its broad shape, but it understates, in ways I want to draw out tonight, the depth and the specificity of what was lost in the transition. The change between medieval and early modern Europe was not simply a series of institutional reforms or economic transformations or intellectual developments. It was a deep alteration in the structure of European consciousness itself, in what could be perceived and what could be discussed and what could be done, in the texture of daily experience, in the relationship between the visible and the invisible dimensions of life. The medieval mind, by which I mean the typical mode of perception and interpretation that a literate or illiterate medieval European would have brought to their daily experience, was systematically dismantled and replaced with something different, and the dismantling involved active suppression of a great many things that the medieval mind had taken for granted. Consider what was eliminated in roughly the order of its disappearance. The active practice of folk medicine, with its parallel tradition of plant knowledge and practical healing, was severely damaged by the witch hunts of the 15th through 17th centuries, which targeted its practitioners with systematic violence over a period of more than 200 years. The estimates for the total number of executions vary widely, but they run into the tens of thousands, with a much larger number of accusations and lesser punishments and informal violence that escaped the official records. The witch hunts have often been treated as a kind of collective madness, a mass psychosocial phenomenon whose causes are obscure. Without disputing the psychosocial dimensions, I want to point out that they had, whatever their ultimate causes, a specific outcome. They eliminated, across most of Europe, the village-level networks of practitioner knowledge that had been transmitting folk medical and ritual practice across generations. The damage was not always immediately visible. Folk practice continued in attenuated forms, often in secret, sometimes preserved by individual families who managed to escape attention. But the dense communal infrastructure that had supported and validated the tradition was broken, and the broken infrastructure could not be rebuilt because the conditions that had allowed it to develop in the first place no longer existed. Consider also what happened to the great network of pilgrimage shrines and confraternities and votive practices that had organized so much of medieval religious life. The Reformation, in Protestant areas, abolished pilgrimage outright as a form of works righteousness, incompatible with justification by faith alone, and the shrines were dismantled, the relics destroyed, the confraternities suppressed. In Catholic areas, the Counter-Reformation rationalized and centralized these practices in ways that eliminated much of what had been most distinctive about them. Local saints with limited regional cults were demoted or quietly forgotten. Wonder-working images and relics were scrutinized for orthodoxy, and many were removed. The lay confraternities were brought under closer episcopal supervision, and their more idiosyncratic practices were suppressed. The result, on both sides of the confessional divide, was a religious landscape dramatically simplified from the medieval original, with most of the local color and regional variation flattened into more uniform institutional patterns. The popular religion of medieval Europe, with its dense particularity, was not merely modified. It was largely demolished, and what replaced it was a more centralized and more legible religious culture that left less room for the kinds of local custom and local meaning that had given the medieval landscape its texture. Consider also what happened to the structure of time itself. We discussed earlier the medieval understanding of time as layered and qualitative, with different hours and seasons carrying different characters, with specific nights opening specific possibilities, with the calendar serving as a complex superposition of liturgical and agricultural and astrological rhythms. This understanding was systematically replaced, beginning in the late medieval period and accelerating through the early modern centuries with a uniform and quantitative model of time. The mechanical clock was the technological precondition. The Protestant rejection of the saints' calendar removed many of the qualitative markers in regions that adopted it. The Gregorian calendar reform of 1582 imposed a single rationalized timekeeping system across Catholic Europe and was eventually adopted, with various delays and disputes, by Protestant regions as well. The development of standardized time zones, much later in the 19th century, completed the transformation by abolishing local solar time as the basis of daily life. The medieval temporal experience, with its richly varied texture, was replaced by an experience in which time was understood as uniform and infinitely divisible, the same in every location and at every hour, available to be measured and bought and sold, without reference to its qualitative character. The change happened gradually enough that no one experienced it as a single rupture, but the cumulative effect over 3 or 4 centuries was the elimination of a basic dimension of human experience that medieval people had taken entirely for granted. Consider also what happened to darkness. The medieval night was, as we discussed earlier, a space of genuine darkness, with distinctive perceptual qualities that the human nervous system responded to in ways shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary preparation. The biphasic sleep pattern, with its long contemplative interval in the middle of the night, was a normal feature of medieval experience. The darkness contained what the darkness contains, including the various perceptual phenomena that humans experience when they spend extended periods in low-light conditions, including the hypnagogic states that occur in the transitions between sleep and waking, including the heightened sensory acuity that develops when the visual system is operating at the edges of its capability. None of this was understood as exotic in the medieval period. It was simply what the night was like. Beginning in the early modern period, with the spread of cheaper candles and oil lamps and eventually gas and electric lighting, the night was progressively colonized by artificial illumination. The biphasic sleep pattern collapsed, replaced by the monophasic pattern that became normal by the 18th century. The contemplative middle of the night, with its particular qualities of consciousness, was eliminated from typical experience. The darkness itself was pushed back to the edges of life, available now only in specific conditions that most people rarely encounter, and the perceptual world that medieval people had inhabited every night of their lives became, for modern people, accessible only through deliberate effort or through the rare circumstance of finding oneself in genuine darkness for an extended period. Each of these changes was real, and each was substantial, and each occurred for reasons that historians can identify and explain. But the cumulative effect of all of them, taken together, was a transformation of European consciousness that was deeper than any of the individual changes would suggest. The medieval mind was not merely modified, it was, in important respects, dismantled, and the dismantling was sufficiently thorough that the resulting modern mind has considerable difficulty even recognizing what was lost. We look at medieval people through frameworks that systematically obscure the dimensions of their experience that our own consciousness has been trained to ignore. We treat their reports of altered states as superstition or pathology. We treat their attentiveness to the qualitative texture of time as primitive belief. We treat their integration of the dead into the life of the community as morbid. We treat their networks of association and folk practice as inefficient or backward. We treat their parallel medical tradition as pseudoscience. In each case, we apply standards developed within the modern consciousness to phenomena that were generated within a different consciousness, and the result is a systematic underestimation of what the medieval experience actually contained. This brings us back, with some force, to the residues we have been examining throughout this exploration. The procession sightings, the ghost reports, the unexplained construction techniques, the cartographic anomalies, the recurring symbols, the deviant burials, the casual references to forgotten things. We have been treating these as puzzles within the medieval period, things that the medieval period contained that we do not fully understand. But they are also puzzles for the modern period, in a different way. They are evidence of dimensions of experience that medieval consciousness had access to, and that modern consciousness does not, and the question of what to do with them depends partly on what we think about that asymmetry. If we believe that modern consciousness represents a kind of clarification and improvement of medieval consciousness, an emergence from superstition into rational understanding, then the residues are simply the parts of medieval experience that have not yet been fully reduced to the categories of modern explanation, and we expect them eventually to yield to further investigation. If we believe that modern consciousness represents a different mode of perception and interpretation, neither better nor worse than the medieval one, but different in its specific capabilities and limitations, then the residues are evidence that medieval people had access to dimensions of experience that we do not, and we should not expect to be able to translate those dimensions cleanly into our own frameworks. I do not know which of these views is correct, and I am not going to argue for either one tonight. What I will say is that the question itself is worth taking seriously, and that the standard assumption of modern intellectual culture, which is the first view, is not as obviously correct as it sometimes presents itself. The dismantling of medieval consciousness was a real historical process with specific causes and specific effects. It was not the inevitable triumph of reason over superstition. It was a particular set of historical developments, including epidemic disease and religious conflict, and economic transformation and political consolidation, that happened to produce a particular outcome. The outcome included some genuine improvements in human understanding and human welfare. It also included some genuine losses of capability and perception, and the losses are not always visible from inside the framework that resulted from them. The medieval period, taken as a whole, was 1,000 years of European life, during which a particular kind of human consciousness developed and matured and produced its characteristic forms of experience and knowledge and practice. That consciousness is gone, and it cannot be recovered. And the attempts to recover it, in modern revivals of medieval religion, or medieval craft traditions, or medieval folk practice, are necessarily reconstructions rather than continuations. The thread of transmission has been cut. What remains is the archaeological and documentary residue, plus our own efforts at imaginative reconstruction, plus the small fragments of medieval practice that survived the transition in fossilized forms within the institutions that succeeded their original carriers. From these materials, we can build a partial picture of what medieval life was like, and the picture, however partial, contains enough strangeness and depth and unresolved question to occupy patient inquiry indefinitely. Picture, before we move toward the closing of our exploration, a moment that did not happen, but that could have happened repeatedly across the centuries we have been discussing. A young person, raised within the medieval framework, encountering for the first time something from outside that framework. A book in a new language, a traveler from a distant region, a practice that does not match what they grew up with. The young person is curious, and they ask questions, and they receive answers that do not quite cohere with what they previously knew. They have a choice. They can dismiss the new information as foreign and return to the framework they were raised in. They can incorporate the new information selectively, integrating it with their existing framework where possible, and ignoring it where it does not fit. Or they can allow the new information to disturb their framework deeply enough that the framework itself begins to change. Across the medieval centuries, these encounters happened in countless small forms, and the cumulative result was the gradual accumulation of pressures that eventually produced the transition we have been describing. The medieval consciousness did not collapse from a single blow. It was eroded by a long sequence of encounters with information and experiences that did not fit, and at some point, the erosion passed a threshold, and the framework reorganized itself into something different. We are inheritors of that reorganization. We carry within our own consciousness the result of decisions made by people we will never know, in encounters whose specifics we cannot reconstruct, that produced the perceptual world we now inhabit, and that closed off the perceptual world they previously knew. 2121, Claude responded, "We come now to the closing part of our long exploration, and I want to use it not to summarize what we have already covered, because summary would flatten what. We come now to the closing part of our long exploration, and I want to use it not to summarize what we have already covered, because summary would flatten what we have been carefully building, but to draw the threads together into a final shape, and to leave you with the right kind of questions to carry away from this. Because the proper outcome of an investigation like this is not a set of answers. It is a different relationship to a body of material that you previously thought you understood, and a heightened sensitivity to the kinds of questions that the material continues to ask of anyone willing to listen carefully. What have we actually been doing across these many hours of slow examination? We have been walking around the edges of medieval Europe, looking at the places where the official narrative thins out, listening for the things that the standard histories do not quite say. We have noticed that the medieval period contains an unusual density of unresolved puzzles, and we have considered why this might be. The answer I have suggested across the various parts of our exploration is structural rather than mysterious. Medieval Europe was a society in which the gap between operational knowledge and documentary knowledge was unusually large, in which most of what was actually known and practiced and experienced moved through informal networks that left little written trace, in which the institutions that produced our archives were systematically disconnected from the substrates that carried most of the period's meaning. The strangeness we encounter when we look at the medieval record is largely a strangeness of distance. We are looking at the thin documentary surface of a thick experiential reality, and the surface, however carefully read, can give us only fragmentary glimpses of what was happening underneath. This is the deflationary half of what we have been doing. The medieval mysteries are, in many cases, not mysteries about hidden knowledge or supernatural phenomena. They are mysteries about ordinary human experience whose context has been lost, ordinary practical knowledge whose transmission chains have been broken, ordinary local meaning whose validating community has dispersed. The recurring symbols are probably craft markers, whose internal vocabulary the masons did not bother to record. The forest customs are probably practical land management practices, whose original justifications dissolved while the practices persisted. The Portolan charts are probably the products of accumulated maritime knowledge transmitted through trading communities that did not write their findings down for outside readers. The ghost reports and procession sightings are probably some combination of misidentification and cultural projection and the perceptual peculiarities of biphasic sleep in deep darkness, framed within an interpretive vocabulary that was available to medieval people and that is no longer available to us. None of these explanations require us to invoke anything beyond ordinary human experience, operating under conditions different from our own. But the deflationary half is not the whole of what we have been doing, because alongside the explicable mysteries, there sit a smaller number of cases that resist the deflationary explanation, that do not reduce cleanly to lost context or broken transmission, or the perceptual peculiarities of pre-modern life. These are the residues, as I have been calling them throughout our exploration, the parts of the medieval record that strain our explanatory resources, even when we apply those resources generously. The cathedral construction techniques that appear suddenly mature, with no clear evolutionary trail. The cartographic features that should not have been knowable to their cartographers. The medieval testimony, repeated across centuries and regions, that includes specific and verified content the witnesses could not have known by ordinary means. The deviant burials applied to specific individuals for reasons the surviving documentation does not adequately explain. These cases are not numerous, but they are not zero either, and the honest position is not to dismiss them and not to make confident metaphysical claims about them, but to hold them in mind as evidence that our understanding of the medieval period contains genuine gaps, and that the gaps may be larger than we are comfortable admitting. What I have tried to do across this exploration is model a particular intellectual attitude that I think is appropriate to material of this kind. The attitude is not skepticism, though it includes skepticism. It is not credulity, though it includes a willingness to take medieval testimony seriously. It is something I would call attentive uncertainty. The medieval period gave us an enormous quantity of evidence about itself, in artifacts and texts and patterns of practice and physical remains, and the evidence cannot be assembled into a single coherent picture without leaving residues. The residues do not prove anything specific. They do indicate that the picture is incomplete in ways that should make us cautious about confident pronouncements in either the orthodox or the alternative direction. The orthodox historian who insists that all medieval phenomena reduce cleanly to ordinary causes is overstating the available evidence. the alternative historian who insists that the residues prove specific theories about lost civilizations or hidden traditions or non-ordinary realities is also overstating the available evidence. The truth, as far as we can responsibly approach it, is that we have a partial view of an enormously complex period whose internal logic we can only partially reconstruct, and the appropriate response is sustained patient attention rather than confident interpretation in any direction. This is, admittedly, a less satisfying conclusion than either the orthodox dismissal or the alternative claim. We are creatures who like our investigations to resolve into clear pictures, and an investigation that ends in attentive uncertainty can feel like an investigation that has failed to do its work. But I would suggest that this is precisely backwards. The investigation that ends in confident answers, when the available evidence does not support confidence, is the failed investigation. The investigation that ends in calibrated uncertainty, in proportion to the actual state of the evidence, is the successful one. And medieval Europe is a domain in which the actual state of the evidence supports neither the orthodox dismissal nor the alternative claim, and where calibrated uncertainty is the only honest position available. What this means in practical terms, for you as a listener who has now spent many hours with this material, is something like the following. The next time you encounter a medieval mystery, whether in a documentary or a book or a conversation, you should be able to ask the right kind of questions about it. What is the actual evidence? What does the surviving documentation say? What does the archaeological record say? What does the iconographic and material record say? What standard explanations have been offered, and how well do they cover the available evidence? What residues remain after the standard explanations have been applied? What kinds of further evidence would help to resolve the residues? And is such evidence available or potentially recoverable? These are the questions that move an investigation forward, and they are quite different from the questions that produce confident pronouncements in either direction. The questions assume that the medieval period contained more than we currently understand, and they direct attention toward the specific places where understanding can grow, while resisting the temptation to fill the gaps with speculation that the evidence does not support. I want to close by returning to where we began, in the long, quiet hours of the medieval night, with the ordinary people whose ordinary lives constituted the actual substance of what we have been exploring. We have, across these parts, ranged across cathedrals and forests and harbours and graveyards and apothecary kitchens and masons' lodges and monastic libraries and parish processions. We have considered the largest patterns of medieval civilization and the smallest details of individual experience. But the thing we have been investigating, finally, is not any of these specific topics. It is the people who lived through them. The peasants and merchants and craftsmen and clergy and women whose names are mostly lost, whose individual stories are mostly unrecoverable, whose specific experiences passed through their particular bodies and minds and were not recorded and are gone. They lived inside their time as completely as we live inside ours. They took for granted what they took for granted, just as we take for granted what we take for granted. They could not see, from inside their framework, what would seem strange about it to people looking back from later periods, just as we cannot see, from inside our framework, what will seem strange about it to people looking back at us from periods yet to come. The strangeness of medieval Europe is not a property of the medieval period itself. It is a property of the relationship between the medieval period and our own, and the relationship is reciprocal. We are as strange to them, viewed from within their framework, as they are to us, viewed from within ours. Hold this in your mind, gently, as you settle into whatever remains of your evening. Somewhere in a village, on a winter night in 1380, a woman was lying awake in the long quiet hour between her first sleep and her second, listening to the sounds outside her cottage, thinking about her children and her work, and her dead husband, and the particular thing that had happened to her that day. She was a complete human being, with the full inner life that any human being possesses, embedded in a framework of meaning that she did not particularly question, because it was the air she breathed. The framework included things we would consider primitive, and things we would consider sophisticated, and things we would not be able to categorize at all. She was not a primitive version of us. She was not a more authentic version of us. She was herself, complete in her own time, doing the work of being human under conditions different from ours. And her conditions, which produced experiences and perceptions and forms of knowledge that we cannot directly access, are the conditions we have been trying, across this long exploration, to imagine our way toward. The imagining is incomplete. It will always be incomplete. The full reality of medieval life is not recoverable from this distance, and the partial reconstruction we can manage is an imperfect approximation of what was actually there. But the imagining itself, the patient, attentive effort to understand a way of being human that is not our own, is itself a valuable practice. It expands the range of what we can recognize as possible. It loosens the grip of our own framework on what we take to be the natural and inevitable shape of human experience. It reminds us that our own consciousness, with all its particular capabilities and limitations, is one historically specific configuration among many, and that the configurations that came before ours and will come after ours have their own integrity and their own losses and their own forms of access to what it means to be alive. If you have found this exploration valuable, if the long, careful walk through medieval Europe has given you something to think about as you fall asleep tonight, or as you go about your day tomorrow, please consider letting me know in the comments below. Tell me what struck you, what you want to hear more about, what other periods or topics you would like to see investigated in the same patient way. Subscribe to Sleepy Tin Foil Hat if you have not already, because the channel exists for the audience that wants this particular kind of thinking, and the audience tells the algorithm we exist by the small act of subscribing. And if you remember, in the morning, that you sat with this for 15 long parts and listened all the way through, take that as evidence that some part of you was hungry for exactly this kind of slow, careful investigation, and that the world contains many more such investigations waiting to be undertaken. Sleep well. Think carefully. The night is long, and the past is deep, and the questions that medieval Europe leaves us with are still, in their patient way, waiting for answers that the careful listener may yet be able to find. That brings our exploration to its close. Thank you for staying with me through all 15 parts. If you would like a script on another topic in the same style, I am ready when you are.